The candles had burned low in the small parlour at Rugeley. A clock ticked softly on the mantel. The doctor sat by the fire, his fingers steady, his face calm as still water. On the table beside him stood a small glass, half filled, catching the light like a sleeping eye. Outside, a slow rain tapped the windowpane, and the smell of coal smoke drifted through the narrow streets of the Staffordshire town. Upstairs, a friend lay dying, his breath rattling in the dark. He had come to celebrate a winning horse, a purse of shining coins, a night of brandy and laughter. Now his limbs seized and his throat closed, and the doctor rose slowly, lifting his lamp. He climbed the wooden stairs without haste, and somewhere below, in a locked drawer, a small brown bottle waited. The quiet town of Rugeley. Good evening and welcome. Welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small. The lamps are low, the doors are closed, and the hours belong to no one but the sleeper. Wherever you are tonight, in whatever corner of the world you have carried this small light, let the room grow still around you. Perhaps you are lying in a warm bed with the rain against your window. Perhaps you are far from home, in a strange room, listening to the hum of a distant city. Perhaps the hour is late where you rest, or perhaps it is only the soft hush of an afternoon that has slipped into shadow. Whisper it to yourself if you like. The place, the hour. Let the story find you there. If this voice has ever kept you company through a long night, take a quiet moment now to subscribe to the channel and to press the small mark of approval on the video. It costs nothing, and it helps the candle burn a little longer so that many others may drift beneath its light. That small kindness carries the tale on. And now, let the room grow still. Let the breath grow slow. Let us drift backward in time, past the noise of the modern hour, past the lamps and the wires and the ticking of familiar clocks, into an England of coal smoke and horse hooves, of market bells and small parish graves. Into the year 1824, into a small town in Staffordshire, where a boy was born who would one day sit beside a dying friend without blinking, and stir a spoon into a cup with a steady hand. The town was called Rugeley. It sat on a low bend of the River Trent, where the Staffordshire fields softened into meadows, and the hills of Cannock Chase rose grey and pale in the north. It was not a great place. It was not a proud place. It had no cathedral, no ancient castle, no famous market beyond the small one held on Tuesdays in the square. It had a church of dark red stone called St. Augustine's, with a clock face that ran a little slow. It had an inn called the Talbot Arms, standing on the main street with its whitewashed front and its stable yard behind. It had a doctor's shop or two, a chemist's window filled with coloured jars, a corn merchant, a saddler, a butcher whose sign creaked in the wind. It had the smell of coal, always coal, drifting down from the pits at Cannock and Hednesford, staining the linens hung on garden lines, blackening the sills of every window before the maid could wipe them clean. Rugeley in that year was a town of perhaps 4,000 souls. Most of them earned their bread by simple trades. Some worked the fields. Some tended the coal barges on the Trent and Mersey Canal, which slid past the town's edge in a slow brown line, hauling black cargo south to Birmingham and beyond. Some worked the timber yards, cutting oak and elm for the wagons of London and the collieries of the north. It was in one of these timber yards, on a small square of land near the church, that Joseph Palmer had built up his trade. He was the boy's father, a hard man with a shrewd eye and a firm hand, who had come to Rugeley with little in his pocket and turned it into a fair fortune of several £1,000s. That was no small thing in the England of that day, when a farm labourer earned 8 or 9 shillings a week, and a good loaf of household bread might cost a full penny. In such a country, several £1,000s set a family apart. It bought a solid brick house on the main street, a black shining trap for Sunday visits, servants in the kitchen, meat on the table 5 days out of 7. The mother of the house was called Sarah. She was a tall woman with dark hair pulled sharply back, a plain black gown with a lace collar, and a small silver crucifix that she wore even indoors. She was a stern woman by day and a fond one by night, kissing her children's brows before the fire, before sending them up the wooden stairs. She kept a pantry lined with jars of preserved damsons and pickled walnuts, a great crock of salted butter, hams hung in muslin from the beam. She kept a good table for her husband and her sons, and she counted every candle and every pound of tea that came into the house. There were 7 children in that house. Their names came in a soft ripple down the years. Joseph, the eldest, quiet and dull. Walter, the 3rd son, who would grow into a heavy drinker and a broken man. George, sharp with figures, destined for a lawyer's desk. Mary Ann, gentle and small. Sarah, plain and pious. Thomas, the youngest, born last of all. And between them, born on the 6th day of August in the year 1824, came William. He was the 6th child. He was a plump baby, they said, with pale skin and a pair of very bright eyes that fixed on things without blinking. The wet nurse noted that the child took the breast greedily, and that he cried very little, even when the pin of his swaddling pricked him. He was a quiet, watchful boy from his very first hour. The house he grew up in stood on the market street of Rugeley. It was a plain brick building, 3 stories tall, with a black-painted door and a boot scraper by the step. Inside, the parlour smelt of beeswax polish and coal smoke. There was a small pianoforte in the corner, brought down from Manchester at great cost. There was a heavy Bible on a stand by the window, and a print of the young Queen Victoria upon the wall, for she came to the throne when William was 13. In the kitchen, a great iron range burned day and night, and a servant girl called Betty scrubbed the flagstones each morning on her hands and her knees. The town outside those doors was a place of small sounds. The church bell rang the hours. The carts rattled over the stones. The cries of the market men rose on Tuesdays, offering onions and cheeses and small brown eggs. The stagecoaches came into the yard of the Talbot Arms 3 times a week, kicking up dust in the summer and slush in the winter. The mail rider passed at 7 each night with his leather bag and his brass horn. In the distance the whistle of the barges drifted up from the canal, and further still the low, steady thump of a colliery engine echoed off the low hills. William grew in that quiet town among coal smoke and market stalls. He walked with his brothers to the small dame school kept by a widow called Mrs. Bonney, where the children learned their letters from a slate and their numbers from a wooden board. He was known even then as a clever boy, quick with figures and quick with a smile, but a boy who did not tell the truth easily. Once, when he was 7, he was caught taking pennies from his sister's small tin box. He denied it with clear, pale eyes. He denied it again when the coins were found in his pocket. He wept only when his father struck him with a leather strap, and even then he wept in silence, without sound, staring at the wall. Joseph Palmer, the father, was proud of his boys and hard on them all. He rose at 5, ate a plate of bacon and cold beef, and walked to his timber yard through the grey morning. He wore a dark coat, a stiff collar, a heavy silver watch chain across his waistcoat. He earned his money by careful trade, buying oak from the great estates of Lord Anglesey and Lord Lichfield nearby, cutting it into planks and beams, selling it on to the pit heads and the waggon makers. He was said to have a rough tongue when a deal went sour, and to have crossed hands with more than one pit foreman on a matter of shillings and pence. When he died in the year 1836, quite suddenly, of a fit that came upon him at the yard, he left behind a small fortune of some £70,000, an enormous sum, more money than most working men could earn in 50 lifetimes. Some in Rugeley whispered even then that the widow Sarah Palmer had not grieved for her husband as a wife might. There were rumours, dark ones that clung to the walls of the town for years after, that she had kept a certain gentleman visitor by night, a lawyer from Stafford, well before her husband's fit. Whether those rumours were true or not, they touched the children like a slow stain. William, at 12, went from a boy in a small brick house to a boy in a house of secret shadows, with a stern, black-clad mother, 7 mouths at the table, and a great heap of money in the bank. The money changed things. It bought the children better schoolrooms. It bought Joseph the eldest a place in the family firm. It bought George his passage to a law office in Wolverhampton. And it bought William, in the year 1839, an apprenticeship in a wholesale chemist's shop in Liverpool. He was 15 years old. He was tall now, broad in the shoulder, with a round, pleasant face and small, pale hands. His mother packed his trunk with fresh shirts, 6 pairs of stockings, a Bible, a Latin grammar, and a small silver watch that had been his father's. She kissed him on the brow at the coach door. She told him to write every Sunday. She told him to pray at night and to keep away from bad company. He said he would. Liverpool in that year was a great grey city of ships and warehouses. It smelt of salt and tar and the dung of horses on the cobbled streets. It smelt of cotton bales just landed from America and of sugar barrels from the West Indies. It smelt of gin at every corner, cheap gin sold by the glass to sailors and to labourers and to women in torn shawls. The chemist shop where William was to learn his trade stood on a narrow street near the docks. It was called Evans and Sons. It had a bow window filled with tall glass jars of coloured water, green and blue and deep ruby red, that glowed like jewels in the fog. Inside, the smell was different. It was the smell of dried herbs and camphor and the sharp bite of laudanum. There were rows of small drawers with brass handles, each drawer labelled in a fine hand: belladonna, opium, strychnine, antimony, calomel, arsenic. The young apprentice slept in a small back room above the shop. He rose at 6. He swept the floor. He washed the marble counter. He weighed powders on a fine brass scale, half a grain at a time, folding them in twists of paper for the customers who came to the door. He learned quickly. He learned the names of the drugs, the doses of them, the effects of each on the human body. He learned which powders eased a cough and which stopped a heart. He learned how to grind a bitter dose and hide it in a spoon of syrup so that a child would take it and smile. His master, a Mr. Evans, said the boy had a light hand and a good memory. But Liverpool was Liverpool. There were tavern doors on every corner. There were card rooms above the tobacconists. There were young women with painted cheeks who would smile at a boy with a full purse. Within a year of his coming to that city, William was caught pocketing the shop's takings. Some £10 in silver and gold had gone from the till over a few short months. He confessed only when the master threatened the constable. His mother came from Rugeley by coach, in her black dress and her small black bonnet, and paid the money back in cash upon the counter. She took her son by the arm and led him home to Staffordshire. The apprenticeship was ended in shame. The chemist's shop closed its door behind him. Back in Rugeley, in the brick house on the market street, the boy was received without a scolding. His mother petted him. She fed him lamb and small hot puddings of currants. She spoke of him to the neighbours as a young man of great promise, misled by wicked companions in a wicked town. She dressed him in a new coat of dark broadcloth. She bought him a fine hat of black beaver. And when he said, quite calmly, that he still wished to be a doctor, she smiled and said she would find him a proper place. So it was arranged. In the year 1841, when William was 17, he was sent as a pupil to Mr. Edward Tilecote, a surgeon of Haywood, a small village not 5 miles from Rugeley. He rode there each morning on a small brown pony. He carried a leather bag with his books and a bright new stethoscope. He learned to bleed a patient at the arm, to set a broken bone, to pull a tooth with a shining pair of iron pincers. He learned to compound a tincture, to boil a poultice, to stitch a wound with a curved needle. He was, said his master, a bright pupil with a steady hand and a quiet manner. He rarely lost his temper. He rarely raised his voice. He listened to the sick with a kind, attentive smile that seemed, somehow, to soothe them. And so the town of Rugeley, drifting through its slow years of coal smoke and market bells, watched the son of Joseph Palmer grow into a promising young man. It saw him ride out each morning in his neat coat, his stethoscope in his bag, his silver watch chain across his waistcoat. It saw him tip his hat to the widows at the church gate. It saw him laugh with the young clerks in the yard of the Talbot Arms, and buy them each a small glass of brandy on a cold night. It saw him kneel beside his mother in the family pew, singing the psalms in a clear, low voice. It saw a well-mannered youth of sound family, a boy with a fortune coming to him, a boy destined, everyone said, for a fine and quiet life among the sick. The candle in the parlour of the brick house burned late that year. Sarah Palmer sat by the fire with her Bible in her lap. Her son sat opposite, reading a heavy book of medicine bound in dark green leather. The rain tapped at the window. The coal shifted in the grate. And somewhere in the young man's mind, behind the pale bright eyes and the gentle smile, a slow small door had begun, very quietly, to open. The making of a doctor. The year turned. The rains of Staffordshire gave way to hard frosts, and the frosts to a slow green spring. William rode out each morning to the house of Mr. Tilecoat at Haywood, and back each evening through the lanes at dusk. His pony's hooves rang on the frozen ruts. His breath rose in a thin cloud before his face. He was 18 now, then 19, and the years of a pupil at a country surgeon's side began to press upon him. He had learned all that a village doctor could teach. He had drawn teeth in the kitchen of a farmhouse. He had set the arm of a canal boy crushed by a mooring rope. He had held the hand of an old woman as she died of dropsy in a small back bedroom smelling of camphor and boiled milk. Mr. Tilecoat said the young man had done well. But Mr. Tilecoat also said, quietly, to Sarah Palmer over a cup of black tea in her parlour, that the boy would need more. A country surgeon could take him only so far. If William was to be a proper doctor, a real doctor with letters after his name, he must go to a hospital. He must walk the wards. He must see the great sick city up close. And so, in the summer of 1842, William Palmer was sent to Stafford Infirmary as a walking pupil. Stafford was the county town, 15 miles to the north of Rugeley, a place of narrow streets and a great stone gale, and a river that ran green and slow beneath a stone bridge. The infirmary stood on the edge of the town, a plain brick building of 2 stories with tall sash windows and a small iron gate. Inside, the smell was heavy and thick. It was the smell of sickness in the age before clean wards, before soap in every basin, before the germ was understood at all. It was the smell of unwashed bodies packed into rows of iron beds, of straw mattresses stained by fever, of bandages soaked in old blood, of chamber pots emptied slowly by tired nurses in grey gowns. It was the smell of carbolic soon to come, but not yet. In 1842, the wards of a country infirmary smelled of the human body in every stage of its suffering. Palmer walked those wards each morning with the house surgeon, a Mr. Bailey. He wore a black frock coat and a stiff white collar. He carried a small notebook and a silver pencil. He watched an operation for the stone, done without any ease of pain, with the poor man tied to a scrubbed pine table by leather straps at the wrists and the ankles, biting down on a folded strip of cloth as the knife went in. He watched an amputation of a leg crushed by a runaway wagon, the surgeon working in a stained apron, the sawdust already spread thick on the floor to catch what would fall. He watched a woman die in childbed of the childbed fever, her face grey, her lips blue, her sheets soaked through. And through it all his hand did not shake, and his colour did not change, and Mr. Bailey noted, with a nod, that the young man had a rare steadiness for one so newly come. But even at Stafford, in that first winter of his walking, whispers began. They were small whispers at first. Palmer, they said, kept late hours at the White Hart Inn in the Market Square. Palmer, they said, was often seen with a certain young woman, a married woman, whose husband was a shoemaker called George Abley. Palmer, they said, had been heard boasting in the tap-room of how much brandy he could hold. In the summer of that year, in a small parlour behind the inn, a wager was laid. The young medical pupil, all of 18 years old, would drink glass for glass with the shoemaker Abley to see which man would stand the longer. The stakes were small, a shilling or 2 upon the table. A cheer from the men gathered round. The brandy was poured, 1 glass, then another, then a third and a fourth, and the room grew warm and loud with laughter. Palmer, it was said, walked home steady on his feet, tipped his hat at the door, and went to bed. Abley did not walk home at all. He was carried out. Within the day he was dead. There was no inquest. There was no whisper of a doctor's hand at the throat of a dying man. It was called a case of overdrink, a foolish wager, a common enough thing in the taverns of the county. The shoemaker was buried in the parish yard, and his young widow, some said, was seen at the door of the infirmary more than once in the weeks that followed. Palmer went about his rounds. He drew his water from the pump. He bowed to the matron in her white cap. And nothing was said in a court, and nothing was written in a book. But the story, small as it was, drifted quietly down the road to Rugeley on the tongues of the coach passengers. It reached the ears of the widow Sarah Palmer. It was noted in the town. It was set aside. It was, people said, only a rumour. His time at Stafford Infirmary ended in the year 1843. He had walked the wards for 18 months. He had a letter of good character from Mr. Bailey. He was 19 years old, and his mother now determined that he should go to London. She would spend the money. She would buy him the finest schooling that a young country surgeon could have. She wrote to a distinguished physician of her acquaintance. She arranged rooms in a decent street. She packed his trunk once again, this time with new linen shirts, a black silk stock for the throat, a dark green coat with velvet at the collar, 3 pairs of good boots, and a set of Latin medical books bound in calf. And in the autumn of that year, at the age of 19, William Palmer boarded the coach at the Talbot Arms in Rugeley, wrapped in a heavy travelling cloak, and rode south through the counties toward the great smoking capital of the world. London, in 1843, was a city of some 2 million souls. It was the largest city in the world by far. It was a city of black river fogs and yellow gas lamps that hissed in the streets at nightfall. It was a city of coal smoke so thick that the linens on a wash line turned grey within an hour, and the noses of the horses in the cab ranks ran with black water. It was a city of costermongers crying jellied eels and roasted chestnuts, of match girls with hollow cheeks, of pickpockets working the crowd at Aldgate, of clerks hurrying with paper bundles under the arm. It was a city of great houses in Belgravia and rookeries in St. Giles, of Turkish carpets and starving children within the same square mile. And at the heart of it, near the black dome of St. Paul's, upon a piece of ground given by King Henry VIII 3 centuries before, stood the vast grey hospital of St. Bartholomew's, called by all of London simply Bart's. Palmer was entered as a student at Bart's in October of that year. He paid a heavy fee of some 30 guineas for his course of lectures. He was given a printed card of admission to the wards. He took lodgings in a small room in a house near Smithfield Market, where the cattle were driven each Monday from the fields of Essex and Hertfordshire, their hooves ringing on the stones from dawn, their bellowing thick in the fog, the smell of them clinging to every wall and every window for a full day after. The rent of his room was 10 shillings a week. His breakfast of chops and bread and tea cost him another shilling each morning at a small eating house on the corner. His mother sent him a bank draft of £200 a year for his keep and his pleasures. It was a sum on which a careful young man might have lived very well indeed. Palmer was not a careful young man. He walked the wards of Bart's in the early hours. He watched Sir William Lawrence operate in the theatre, the students packed on the steep wooden benches above, leaning forward, holding their breath. He watched a leg taken off in less than a minute, the tourniquet screwed tight, the great curved knife flashing in the lamplight, the saw at work in 3 swift strokes. He learned to open a vein and to close it. He learned to dress a wound with lint and a thin bandage. He learned the names of the bones from a yellowed skeleton hung upon a hook in the dissecting room, and the courses of the arteries from a dead body opened upon a marble slab. The dissecting room smelt of preserving spirits and of the poor of London, for the bodies were often the bodies of paupers, of drowned sailors, of women dead in the workhouse of no name at all. Palmer worked at these bodies with a steady hand and a mind that took in everything. When the day was done and the lecture hall had emptied, and the gas lamps of Smithfield flared up in the fog, William Palmer put on his best coat and his silk stock and his black hat, and he walked out into another London altogether. There were racing houses in Covent Garden. There were billiard rooms above the taverns of Long Acre. There were card rooms behind the plate-glass windows of St. James's Street, where a young man with money in his pocket could sit down with strangers at green baize tables and lose a year's allowance in a single evening. There were young women of a certain kind who kept their small rooms in Panton Street and in Haymarket, whose smiles cost more than their bread. There were oyster shops and supper rooms open till 3, where champagne stood in ice buckets and the piano tinkled through the smoke. Palmer, said those who knew him then, took to all of it with a soft, quiet passion. He did not drink to excess. He did not gamble in loud cries. He sat at the tables with the same still, watchful smile he had used at the sick-bed, and he laid his coins upon the cards without any change of face. He lost. He lost again. He lost more. Within a year, the £200 sent from Rugeley was gone by Christmas. He wrote home for more. His mother sent it. He lost that too. He borrowed from the moneylenders of Chancery Lane at heavy interest, signing bills at 3 months and 6 months and 12, promising repayments he could not make. He signed the name of William Palmer, surgeon, upon each paper, in a careful, clear hand. There was, in this second year at Bart's, one small dark incident that has drifted down through the reports of those who watched him. A fellow student, a young man of Palmer's own age, took supper with him at a chop house near Newgate on a wet November evening. They ate mutton and drank stout together, and then walked out into the fog. The young man was ill by morning. He was carried to his lodgings. He grew worse through the day. He was seized with violent sickness and cramps, and by evening he was dead. The cause was set down as a fit of a natural kind. No one asked further questions, but among the students of Bart's, in the whispered corners of the lecture theatre, 1 or 2 remembered that Palmer had ordered the drinks that night, and had pressed the young man to take a second glass, and had watched him drink it. Nothing was proved. Nothing was said aloud. The dead student was buried in a plain grave in a London churchyard. Palmer wore black to the funeral, and stood at the graveside with his hat in his hand. He worked on through the winter, through the spring, through the second autumn. He walked the wards. He passed his examinations. He memorized the doses of every poison in the pharmacopoeia, the fatal grain and the safe grain, the antidote and the sign of overdose. He wrote out in his neat, clear hand the effects of arsenic and antimony, of strychnine and opium, of prussic acid and belladonna. He noted the symptoms as he had seen them upon the wards: convulsions of the limbs, locking of the jaw, foaming at the lips, failure of the heart, silence. In the month of August, in the year 1846, William Palmer was admitted a member of the Royal College of Surgeons of England. He was 22 years old. He received his diploma, sealed with red wax, in the great hall of the college at Lincoln's Inn Fields. He wrote home to his mother in Rugeley with the news. She wept over the letter at the parlour fire. She spoke of it to the neighbours the next Sunday at church. Her son, her William, was now a qualified surgeon. He might set up his brass plate anywhere in the kingdom. He came home to Staffordshire in that same autumn. He came home a doctor. He came home with a black bag of instruments, a small case of glass phials, a bill for £800 owing to the moneylenders of London, and a habit of standing very still at the sick-bed with a small, quiet smile. The coach set him down at the door of the Talbot Arms in Rugeley on a grey evening. His mother met him with a candle at the step. The rain was falling softly upon the stones. The clock at St. Augustine's was striking the hour, and the small brick house on the market street, warm now with the fire of homecoming, opened its door once more and closed behind him with a quiet click that no one in the town could hear. The turf and the temptation. The autumn rains held long that year over Staffordshire. The lanes ran with brown water. The elms along the road to Rugeley dropped their leaves in slow, wet drifts. William Palmer, newly a surgeon of London, walked out each morning from the small brick house on the market street in a coat of dark broadcloth, a silk hat upon his head, a leather bag in his hand. The bag held his stethoscope, his lancets, a small brass mortar, and a folded roll of clean linen for bandages. He had hung out his brass plate upon the doorpost, above the boot scraper his father had set there 30 years before. It read, in a fine engraved hand, William Palmer, surgeon and apothecary. The town of Rugeley read the plate as it passed. The town nodded. The town said, "Here is a proper doctor now, home to us at last." His practice began slowly. A doctor in a country town in that year needed patience. The old physician of Rugeley, a stiff grey man called Mr. Bamford, had held his ground for 40 years. The farmers of the low fields, the coalers of Cannock, the widows of the market street, all had their own healers already. Palmer sat many mornings in the small back room he had made his surgery, with the coals crackling in the grate and the clock ticking on the wall, waiting for a knock at the door that did not always come. When a patient did come, he treated them with a soft, attentive smile. He bled a farmer's wife for a headache. He dressed the scalded arm of a canal boy. He drew the tooth of a cobbler who paid him in a pair of new boots. He set a broken wrist for a stable lad, and took no fee at all. Word passed. The young Mr. Palmer, they said, was gentle with the poor. He had a light hand upon a child. He had a soothing voice at the sick-bed. The knocks at the door came more often. Yet the practice did not bring in what a young man of London tastes required. A country doctor's living was a slow thing, gathered in shillings and half-crowns, in a shilling for a visit and half a crown for a night call. In a good year, a village surgeon might clear £200. In a lean year, less. Palmer had come home owing £800 to the moneylenders of Chancery Lane. The bills fell due at 3 months and 6 months, and each post from London brought a fresh demand upon fresh paper. He wrote back with polite promises. He signed his name in the same neat, clear hand. He asked for another month, and another after that. He did not tell his mother of the letters. He kept them locked in a small drawer of the desk in the back room, beneath a bundle of prescriptions and a folded map of the county. To meet the bills, Palmer turned in that first year to the small brown books of the racecourse. Racing in England in that age was the sport of every class. It was the pastime of dukes, and it was the poison of stable lads. The great courses ran at Doncaster and Newmarket, at Epsom and Ascot and Chester. The smaller ones ran at Wolverhampton, at Stafford, at Shrewsbury, at Manchester and Liverpool and York. On every course there was a strip of green turf, a white rail, a row of stands, a betting ring where the men in tall hats gathered with pencils and folded books. There were bookmakers laying odds by the shout, and gentlemen backing horses by the guinea and the £5 note. There were tipsters selling the name of a certain runner for a shilling behind the stables. There were touts and thieves and swindlers, and there was, above all, the horse. The clean, bright creature moving at speed upon the turf, its silks flashing in the sun, its hooves drumming the earth as 40,000 throats went up in one great roar. Palmer had first tasted the racecourse in London. He had gone down to Epsom for the Derby of 1844 with a party of students, in a wagonette hired for the day, packed with cold fowl and bottles of ale. He had watched the great race from the rail. He had laid a sovereign upon a horse and lost it. He had laid another and won 3. He had come home in the dusk with the taste of victory upon him, and a small heat in his blood that would never quite leave him again. Now, back in Staffordshire, with a country practice too small to feed his London appetites, he began to ride out to the meetings of the county. Wolverhampton in the spring, Stafford in the summer, Chester in the autumn. He hired a decent horse from the livery yard at the Talbot Arms. He wore a coat of pale grey. He carried a small brown book bound in calf, with a silver pencil looped through the spine. He learned the names of the horses, the colours of the owners, the weights and the odds and the going. At first he won small sums. He won £5 upon a mare at Wolverhampton. He won 12 upon a gelding at Chester. He came home with the coins clinking in his coat pocket, and paid down a bill in London, and sat at his mother's table with a bright, easy smile. She saw the smile, and she was glad. She thought her son had a rare fortune upon him. She did not know of the small brown book in the drawer. But the turf, in that age or any other, does not pay a country doctor his way for long. The wins grew fewer. The losses grew larger. A horse that was to be certain broke down at the first turn. A horse that was thought to have no chance came in a length ahead of the field. Palmer began to borrow money in Rugeley itself, quietly, from the small clerks of the town, from a corn merchant, from an old friend of his father's. He gave notes of hand for £20, for 50, for 100 at a time. He always paid the first note when it came due, so that the lender would take another. He always spoke of a certain sum coming to him from a certain quarter, of a horse that would run in a fortnight, of a bill that would be settled by the London firm of his solicitor. The men of Rugeley, respectable men who knew his mother and remembered his father, took his word. They handed over the coins. They wrote his name in their own small books, and they smiled and shook his hand. Amid this slow slide into the world of the betting ring, William Palmer courted a young woman of the town, and in the autumn of 1847 he was married. Her name was Anne Brooks, though she went in the town by the name of Anne Thornton, for she was the natural daughter of a certain Colonel William Brooks of Stafford, a retired officer of the East India Company. Her mother had been the colonel's housekeeper, a woman called Mary Thornton, a strange, sharp, black-clad person who was said to keep a small painted casket of gold sovereigns hidden beneath her mattress and to threaten fits of madness when crossed. Anne had been raised in a modest household near the town of Stafford, a plain, quiet girl with soft brown hair and a soft, low voice. She was said to be gentle. She was said to be pious. She was said to be sensible with money. Her father, the colonel, had left her, upon his death some years before, an income of a few £100 a year, tied up in trust and paid to her by quarterly draft. They were married in the church of Abbots Bromley, a village of the county, on the 7th day of October in 1847. The bride wore a plain dark travelling gown and a straw bonnet trimmed with white. The groom wore his black silk stock and a coat of deep blue broadcloth. Sarah Palmer sat in the front pew in her heavy black and wept a little, from joy, she said, and dabbed her eyes with a small square of lace. There was a wedding breakfast of cold ham and boiled fowl and a bottle of port. There was a short speech from the bride's guardian. There was a slow ride back to Rugeley in a hired chaise. And that night, in the small brick house upon the market street, the doctor and his wife took the upper bedroom, and the door was closed and the candle put out. For a season the marriage seemed a quiet good. Anne kept the house with a plain, steady hand. She rose early. She ordered the meals. She counted the linen. She sewed by the fire in the evenings while her husband read the racing papers by candlelight. She spoke gently to the servant girl. She went twice on a Sunday to St. Augustine's Church, kneeling in the family pew with her hands folded in white gloves. Her small income from the Colonel's Trust came in each quarter, £30 here, £40 there, and she gave it into her husband's keeping with a soft smile, for that was the way of a wife in that age. The wife's money became the husband's money the moment the ring was set upon her finger. It was written so in the law, and preached so from the pulpit. Anne Palmer did not question it. She loved her husband. She was, said those who knew her, a good and simple young woman. She did not go to the races. She did not sit in the betting stands. She did not see the small brown book. She did not see, when he came home at night, the light of fever in his pale bright eyes, the way his hand tightened upon the glass of brandy, the way his laughter sometimes cracked in the middle of a word. She saw only the husband who kissed her brow at the door and asked how her day had gone. The betting book grew thicker. The losses grew heavier. In the spring of 1848, Palmer took his young wife to the races at Chester. He wished to be seen there with her, a respectable married man, a country surgeon of good family, dressed in his best coat and driving his own dog-cart at the head of a smart bay pony. She sat beside him in a bonnet of straw and a shawl of paisley pattern. She smiled shyly at the crowd. She held his arm as they walked through the paddock. She did not know the sums he laid upon the horses that day. He lost £200 before the last race was run. He did not tell her. He drove her home through the evening lanes with the same steady smile, and he stopped at an inn on the road, and he sat her down at a small parlour table and ordered her a glass of hot negus with a lump of sugar in it, and he went out to speak to a man at the stables, and he returned 20 minutes later with the smile still upon his face, and he said the day had been a pleasant one. That summer the moneylenders of London grew hard. A firm called Padwick and Company sent down a clerk to Rugeley itself, a small man in a shabby coat, who put up at the Talbot Arms and made inquiries. The clerk called at the surgery. He spoke in a low voice at the door. He asked for a settlement of certain bills. Palmer received him in the back room, sat him by the fire, poured him a glass of sherry, and spoke with him for an hour, with the same soft, attentive smile. When the clerk went away, he carried with him a fresh bill of hand for the full sum, drawn at 6 months, and signed in the fine, clear script that had by now become known in the offices of Chancery Lane. The clerk carried something else as well, whispered doubts. He wrote back to his firm that the young doctor at Rugeley was a pleasant man of gentlemanly manner, but that his practice was small, and his outgoings appeared to be great, and that the security of the paper was of a low order. Yet the country and the town and the church at Abbots Bromley and the small brick house on the Market Street saw only the outside of William Palmer, surgeon, married man, faithful son. He rode out each morning to his patients. He came home to his young wife each evening. He knelt beside her in the family pew on the Sabbath and sang the psalms in a clear, low voice. He was seen at the Talbot Arms in the evenings with a small glass of brandy and water, laughing softly with the coach passengers and the corn merchants and the young clerks of the town. He was known as a good friend, an easy loser at a hand of whist, a generous man who would stand a round of drinks when a horse of his had come in. Only in the small back room of the brick house, when the door was locked and the candle was low, did William Palmer sit alone with his brown book and his sheaves of bills. Only then did the smile come off his face. Only then did his pale bright eyes go still and hard as he added up the figures in his careful hand and turned the page and added again and saw the truth of it. He owed, by the end of that year of his marriage, more than £1,000. He earned, in his slow country practice, perhaps 200. His wife's small income would not cover the interest upon the interest. And still the bills fell due, and still the horses lost, and still the moneylenders wrote from London in cramped clerks' hands upon paper folded thrice. He sat late one night by the fire in that back room, in the winter of 1848, with the frost upon the window-panes and the church clock striking 12. A single candle stood upon the desk. The brown book lay open. His wife slept upstairs, breathing softly under a heavy quilt. His mother slept across the town in her own brick house, with her Bible upon the table and her small silver crucifix upon her breast. The town of Rugeley slept all around him, in coal smoke and stone and slow winter rain. And William Palmer, surgeon, apothecary, husband, member of the Royal College of Surgeons of England, sat very still and looked at the small locked drawer at the corner of the desk where the London bills were kept, and let his thoughts go, slowly and gently, to the row of brass-handled drawers he had once known in a chemist's shop in Liverpool, with their fine hand-written labels: belladonna, opium, strychnine, antimony, arsenic. He closed the brown book. He rose from the chair. He carried the candle to the door. He climbed the wooden stairs to the upper bedroom, where his young wife slept in the warm, quiet dark, and he laid himself down beside her, and he did not sleep, and the frost thickened upon the window until the first pale light of morning began to touch the roofs of the sleeping town. The cradle and the grave. The frost stayed long that winter upon the roofs of Rugeley, and when at last it went slowly, in a slow, soft dripping from every eave. The spring of 1849 came in green and low, and with it came the first child of the marriage. He was born on the 11th day of October in that year, in the upper bedroom of the small brick house upon the Market Street, with the midwife of the town in attendance, and a servant girl running up and down the stairs with bowls of hot water and folded strips of linen. The child was a boy. He was a strong red child with a loud voice and a thick shock of dark hair. The doctor stood at the foot of the bed with his coat off and his shirt-sleeves rolled to the elbow, and when the midwife laid the small red bundle in his hands, he looked down at it with a slow, quiet smile. He named the boy William Brooks Palmer, after himself and after the colonel who had left the small income to Anne. The bells of St. Augustine's rang out for the christening. Sarah Palmer wept in the parlour and said a grandson had come to her at last. And for a season, the small brick house was warm with the sound of a child, and the doctor rode out to his patients each morning with a fresh spring in his step, and the moneylenders of London were held off with a fresh sheaf of bills. The boy lived. That much must be said at the very start. William Brooks Palmer would live long past his infancy, past his childhood, past the year in which his father would stand upon a scaffold before a great silent crowd. He would grow up in the care of his grandmother Sarah, in the same brick house on the market street, and he would live into the reign of another century. He is the one child of that marriage who did not go early into the ground. All the others did. The first to go was a small daughter, born in the summer of 1850. She was named Elizabeth, after Anne's late grandmother, and she was baptized in St. Augustine's Church on a bright June morning, with the doctor holding her in his arms above the stone font and speaking the words of promise in a low, clear voice. She was a small child, thin at the wrist, with pale blue eyes and a soft mewing cry. She fed poorly. She slept poorly. In the winter of that year, when she was some 6 months old, a fit came upon her one evening in the nursery. Her small body stiffened. Her small hands clenched. Her small mouth opened in a soundless O, and a thin froth stood upon her lips. The nurse ran down the stairs crying for the master. The master came up at once, in his shirt-sleeves, with a candle in his hand. He knelt beside the cradle. He placed his ear upon the small heaving chest. He said, quite calmly, that it was a convulsion of the kind common to infants of that age. He fetched a small brown phial from the case in the back room. He mixed a few drops of a clear liquid into a spoon of warm milk and sugar. He held the spoon to the small mouth. The child took it. The fit passed. The child slept. And by the morning, the child was dead. The parish register for Rugeley records the burial of Elizabeth Palmer, aged 7 months, in the yard of St. Augustine's on a grey January day in 1851. The doctor himself wrote out the certificate of death. He set down the cause in his own careful, clear hand. Convulsions. The vicar read the short service at the graveside. The small oak coffin, no longer than a good-sized loaf, was lowered upon 2 lengths of stout cord into a hole that had been cut through frozen earth by the sexton the day before. Sarah Palmer stood by the grave in her heavy black. Anne Palmer wept quietly into a folded square of linen. The doctor stood bareheaded in the cold, his hat in his hand, his pale eyes upon the small dark opening in the ground. The neighbours came home with the family and drank a cup of hot tea in the parlour. They said, as country folk always said in that age, that the Lord had gathered a little lamb into his arms. They said children were often taken young. They said the doctor and his wife would have others. And so it proved. The second to go was another boy. He was born in the following summer, in July of 1851, and named Henry. He was a plump child with round pink cheeks. He lived 72 hours. On the 3rd day the fit came upon him also, at his mother's breast in the upper bedroom, and the doctor was called from his surgery, and again the small brown phial, and again the spoon of warm milk. Again the child took it. Again the fit passed. Again by the morning the child was cold. The certificate was written out in the same clear hand. Convulsions. The small coffin was carried through the same iron gate of the churchyard by the same sexton. Anne sat in the pew with her hands folded in her lap and no tears at all upon her face, for she had wept herself dry in the night, and now there was only a low, steady humming in her ears that would not stop. The doctor stood at her side and pressed her hand once at the graveside, and the pressure was gentle and quiet, and he did not weep either. There is, in the old records of the town, a small entry in the account book of the sexton at St. Augustine's for that year. It reads, 2 shillings and 6pence for the digging of a small grave. William Palmer, surgeon, of the Market Street. The same entry appears again in the year 1852, when a small daughter named Frank, called so after Anne's stepfather, lived 4 days upon the earth, and was then laid down among her small brother and small sister in the same churchyard yard. And it appears again in the year 1854, when another son, named John, lived 5 days and was laid down in his turn. 4 small graves in 3 winters. 4 small coffins carried through the same iron gate. 4 short services at the same stone font of the churchyard. 4 small entries in the sexton's book at 2 shillings and 6pence apiece, and the certificates each in the doctor's own clear, careful hand. Convulsions. 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 There were no inquests. There were no whispers in the town, or none loud enough to be spoken aloud. Infant death in the year 1850 was the common fate of the small child in England. Of every 100 babies born, more than 15 went into the earth before their first birthday. In the coal towns, in the mill towns, in the poor streets of London and Manchester, the figure was higher still. Convulsions was a word written every day upon every parish register in the land. It covered 100 true causes, from bad milk to fever, to the whooping cough, to the smallpox, to the simple stopping of a fragile little heart. No coroner rode out to a doctor's house in a small county town when a doctor's own child died of a common infant fit. No neighbour called at the surgery to ask what had been in the spoon of warm milk. The doctor was a member of the Royal College of Surgeons of England. He kept his brass plate upon the doorpost. He knelt in the family pew each Sabbath. He wore his black silk stock. And when his small children died in the upper bedroom of his own house, it was he himself who wrote the paper that closed the matter. The mother of these small children must be spoken of gently, for she was, by every account of those who knew her, a good and simple young woman. Anne Palmer was in her late 20s in those years. She was thin now, thinner than she had been at her wedding. Her soft brown hair was drawn back tightly beneath a white cap. Her hands had grown pale and small. She wore black for a full year after each burial, as was the custom of the age, and by the time the 4th small coffin was carried through the churchyard gate, she had scarcely stepped out of black at all. She kept a small tin box in the drawer of her bedside table, and in that box she kept 4 small locks of hair, each tied with a slender ribbon, and a folded slip of paper with each small name written upon it in her own careful hand. Elizabeth, Henry, Frank, John. She would take out the box in the long afternoons when the doctor was riding out to his patients, and she would sit by the window in the upper bedroom with the tin upon her lap, and she would lift out each lock in turn, and she would touch it to her cheek. Then she would put the lid back on. Then she would go down to the parlour and take up her sewing. She spoke to no one of the small tin. She did not speak of the small graves, even to her mother, even to her husband's mother, even to the maid who had held her hand through each of the 4 confinements. She kept her grief the way a country wife of that age kept a bruise, under a long sleeve, in a dark room, where no one might see. The doctor did not keep his grief in any place at all. It is possible that he had none. It is possible he had a great deal, and had learned very early to put it in a small locked drawer, along with the bills from Chancery Lane. In any case, he showed nothing. He rode out each morning to his patients. He came home each evening to his wife. He ate his mutton at the small round table. He drank his glass of brandy and water by the fire. He read his racing papers by candlelight. He knelt at his mother's side each Sabbath in the family pew, and when the vicar spoke from the pulpit of the innocent souls of little children, safe now in the bosom of the Lord, he bent his head in the same soft, attentive way he had bent it at the sick-bed, and he closed his pale, bright eyes for the space of a minute, and then he opened them again, and the smile was still there. Yet the household expenses grew smaller, and this too must be spoken of, for it belongs to the story of the 4 small graves. A child in that age cost money to keep, even when it lived only a day. There was the fee to the midwife, 5 shillings for a plain confinement in the town. There was the fee to the wet nurse, when the mother's milk did not come, at 7 shillings and 6pence a week. There was the linen for the cradle, the small woolen shawls, the small cotton caps. There was the christening and the christening supper, and the small silver spoon that Sarah Palmer gave to each grandchild as it came. There was the fee to the sexton, and the small oak coffin, and the mourning card, and the black gloves for the mourners, and the black cloth ribbon upon the door-knocker for the full month after. A living child would grow into a boy or a girl needing shoes and stockings and schooling and a place in the world. A living child would need, at the end of things, a portion out of the estate. A dead child cost the household a few pounds in ribbons and coffins, and then cost it nothing at all. The doctor of Rugeley, sitting in the small back room with the brown book upon his desk and the London bills locked in the drawer, was not a man to overlook such an arithmetic. Whether he did more than sit with it and turn it over in his mind, whether the small brown phial and the spoon of warm milk carried anything more than an old-fashioned country soothing draught, is a thing that no living voice can now say for certain. Only the 4 small graves in the yard of St. Augustine's remained to be counted. By the end of the year 1854, of the 5 children born to William and Anne Palmer, only one still walked upon the earth. He was the eldest boy, William Brooks Palmer, 4 years old, quiet and grave, with his father's pale eyes and his mother's soft brown hair. He was sent much of the day to his grandmother's house upon the market street, for Sarah Palmer would keep the child at her knee for long hours, feeding him small currant buns from a blue and white plate, teaching him his letters from a hornbook that had once been her own. She would not, said the neighbours, let the child sleep at his father's house any more than she must. She would send a maid to fetch him at dusk, and would take him home to her own upper bedroom, and would tuck him in beside her under the heavy quilt, and would keep the candle burning by the bedside all through the night. Whether she did this out of a plain grandmother's love, or out of a slow, small doubt she could not yet put a name to, is another thing that cannot now be known. And still the debts grew, and still the horses lost, and still each quarter's small draft from the trust of the late Colonel Brooks came into Anne's soft, pale hand, and passed at once into her husband's keeping, £30 here, £40 there, a sum that would keep the servants and the fire and the meat upon the table, but that would not begin to pay the interest upon £1,000 owing in Chancery Lane. Palmer sat in the back room in the long evenings of that winter, and turned the pages of the brown book, and totalled the columns, and turned the pages again. He wrote out fresh bills of hand for the moneylenders, and signed his name in the same fine, clear script. He rode out each morning to his patients with the same soft, attentive smile. He came home each evening to his silent wife and to the empty nursery, where 4 small cradles had stood in 4 short years, and where now only the dust turned slowly in the last light of the day. Then, upon a raw January afternoon in the year 1854, a hired chaise drew up before the door of the brick house on the market street, and the driver climbed down and unloaded a small black leather trunk bound with brass. And out of the chaise, stepping stiffly down onto the wet cobbles in a heavy black cloak and a bonnet of black straw, came a thin, sharp woman in her late 50s, with a mouth pressed into a hard, pale line, and small dark eyes that missed nothing. She had come, she said, from Stafford, to visit her daughter for a fortnight. She had come with her small painted casket. She was the mother of Anne. She was Mary Thornton. And the doctor, standing at the door of his house in his black frock coat and his silk stock, took her cold hand in his own and smiled at her softly, and welcomed her in from the raw January cold. The mother-in-law's visit. The chaise wheels stopped their creaking upon the wet stones of the market street, and the small painted casket was carried in through the black-painted door, and set down upon the flagged floor of the hall. It was a plain box of dark wood, no bigger than a lady's writing case, banded with 2 thin strips of iron and fitted with a small brass lock. Mary Thornton kept the key upon a silver chain about her neck. She kept it under the bodice of her heavy black gown. She had kept it there for many years, and she did not mean, said the servant girl afterward, to let it go for any hand in the house of her son-in-law. The doctor watched the casket carried in with the same soft, attentive smile he wore at the sick-bed. He did not offer to take it up himself. He did not offer, either, to keep it for her in the small back room where the strong iron safe stood in the corner behind the desk. He merely tipped his head to the maid, and said the small trunk was to be set beside the bed in the guest chamber above, and that his mother-in-law would have the front room upon the 2nd floor for the whole of her stay. The front room upon the 2nd floor was a plain, low chamber with a sash window that looked down upon the wet cobbles of the market street. There was a heavy tester bed with dark green curtains, drawn back and tied with braided cord. There was a small round table by the window, spread with a white linen cloth, and upon the cloth a china basin and a plain china jug for washing. There was a wardrobe of dark oak, and a chest of drawers with a looking-glass upon it in a frame of black wood, and a low chair with a rush seat set beside the fire. The maid had laid a fresh fire that morning of small dry sticks and a shovelful of coal from Cannock, and it burned now with a slow, steady red heart in the black iron grate. The room smelt faintly of the beeswax with which the maid had rubbed the wood the day before, and beneath that of the cold, clean smell that a country bedroom in Staffordshire always held in January, of stone and lavender and old wool. Anne came slowly up the stairs behind her mother, holding the hem of her black gown clear of the treads. She had wept a little when the chaise first drew up at the door, out of what feeling she could not have said herself. She had not seen her mother since the last small burial in the yard of St. Augustine's. The letters between them had been short and few. Now the mother turned upon the landing and looked into the daughter's thin white face with those small dark eyes that missed nothing, and she said only, in a voice as dry as an old leaf, that the child had grown poorly, and that the house smelt of camphor and closed doors. Then she went into the front chamber and closed the door behind her, and the daughter stood alone upon the landing for a long moment, with one hand upon the newel post and the other pressed to her mouth, before she turned and went softly down again to see about the tea. They had planned a fortnight. That was the word the doctor had used at the door, in the softest and most pleasant voice, welcoming his wife's mother to the house of Rugeley for a fortnight's rest in the country. He had spoken of the good clean air of Staffordshire, of the quiet of the small streets, of the wholesome table Anne kept, of the fire he would build up in the front chamber each night with his own hand. He had spoken of drives out to see the fields at Cannock Chase in his own smart dog-cart. He had spoken of a possible visit to the ruins of the great abbey at Lichfield when the roads dried out a little. Mary Thornton had listened in silence, her mouth pressed into its hard, pale line, her small dark eyes moving over his face and down to his neat white hands and back again. She had said nothing of drives to Cannock Chase or to the abbey at Lichfield. She had asked only what were the arrangements for locking the front chamber door at night, and whether the key was already in the lock, and whether the door held true against a firm push. For she was afraid of him. That much the servant girl swore to afterward, and swore to more than once, in a low voice and with her apron twisted in her hands. Mary Thornton had come into the house of her son-in-law, full of a small hard fear that she had carried down the road from Stafford with her painted casket. She had said, to a neighbour in Stafford, before ever she set out, that she was going into the house of her daughter for a fortnight, but that she did not think she should come out of it alive. She had said this quite calmly, over a cup of black tea, without weeping and without any raising of the voice. The neighbour had laughed a little, uneasily, and had told her not to speak so darkly, and had said that her son-in-law was a proper doctor of the Royal College, and a member of the church at Rugeley, and a man of fair standing in the county. Mary Thornton had drunk her tea and had said no more. But she had gone home and had drawn up her will that very night, and had left everything she had, some £8,000 in the funds and a few small pieces of plate, to her daughter Anne Palmer of Rugeley, absolutely and without condition, and she had put the will into her small painted casket, and had turned the small brass key, and had hung the silver chain about her neck. Now she sat in the front chamber upon the low rush-seated chair by the fire, still in her heavy black cloak, still in her bonnet of black straw, with the small painted casket beside her upon the floor. She would not, she said, take off the cloak until the fire had properly warmed the room. She would not take off the bonnet until she had drunk a cup of hot tea. The maid brought up the tea upon a small japanned tray, in a plain white cup, with a lump of sugar and a small jug of thin milk. Mary Thornton took the cup in her thin fingers. She held it beneath her nose and breathed the steam. She sipped it slowly, watching the maid all the while, and when the maid had gone she rose from the chair and turned the key of the front chamber door and dropped the key into the pocket of her gown. The first 3 nights passed without event. She came down each morning to a breakfast of tea and toast and a small boiled egg. She spoke sharply to the maid over the folding of a napkin. She spoke sharply to Anne over the state of the linen in the airing cupboard. She spoke sharply to the doctor over the price of coals in the town of Rugeley, which she said had been dearer that winter than in Stafford by threepence the hundredweight, and which she suspected the coal merchant of the town of cheating him upon. The doctor listened to each remark with the same soft, attentive smile. He agreed with her upon the linen. He agreed with her upon the coals. He offered, upon the second morning, to drive her out in the dog-cart to see the great stand of elms at the edge of the park at Blithfield. She declined. She said the January wind would go through her bones. She said she would sit by the fire with her daughter and her small painted casket, and would take the country air only through the open sash of the front chamber window at midday. Upon the fourth day she was taken ill. It came upon her in the morning as she sat at the breakfast table in her heavy black. She set down her cup half full. She pressed her hand to her stomach. She said, in a low, sharp voice, that the tea had a strange taste upon it and that she would take no more. She rose from the table. She went upstairs slowly, one hand upon the banister, one hand pressed still against her side. Anne followed her at once, weeping, calling for the maid to fetch hot water and a bottle of camphor. The doctor came out of the back room in his shirt-sleeves and stood at the foot of the stairs and said in a soft, calm voice that he would come up presently. He finished the writing of a small note upon his desk. He blotted it with sand from the small brass tray. He folded it and sealed it with a drop of red wax and set it aside. Then he took up his black leather bag from the corner of the surgery and he climbed the wooden stairs to the front chamber. What passed in that chamber, in the hour that he was alone at the bedside of his mother-in-law, no living voice can say for certain. The maid heard only the low murmur of his voice through the closed door, and a single sharp cry from the sick woman, and then a long silence, and then the sound of a small phial being uncorked and a spoon being rapped once against the rim of a cup. Anne sat upon the top stair with her face in her hands. The maid came up and down with fresh hot water. The clock in the hall below struck 11, and then the half-hour, and then 12. When the doctor at last came out of the front chamber, he was carrying his black leather bag in one hand and a small folded square of white paper in the other. He closed the door softly behind him. He looked down at his young wife upon the top stair, and he laid his hand for a moment upon her thin, bowed shoulder, and he said, in the same soft, calm voice, that her mother was resting now, and must not be disturbed for the rest of the day. She did rest, or seemed to. The maid, going up on tiptoe every hour, with a fresh coal for the grate, reported that the sick woman lay very still under the heavy quilt, with her small dark eyes shut and her thin lips slightly parted, and with her breath drawn slowly and evenly. In the evening she took a little thin broth from a spoon, held to her mouth by Anne, and a small draught of a clear liquid from a phial, held to her mouth by the doctor. She looked at him over the rim of the spoon, and her small dark eyes were open now, and they were bright and hard, and they did not close again for a long space after the spoon was withdrawn. She did not speak. She did not ask what was in the phial. She swallowed the draught and turned her face slowly to the wall, and lay so through the night, with the fire burning low in the grate and the frost thickening upon the window-pane. For 9 days more she lay in the front chamber. Some days she seemed a little better. She sat up against the pillows in her white cap, and took a little tea and a morsel of dry toast, and spoke sharply to the maid about the folding of a napkin, as if the illness had been only a passing chill. Other days she sank low again, and her breath came shallow, and her small hands twitched upon the quilt, and she would take nothing but water. The doctor came up to her 3 times a day. He carried always his small black leather bag. He carried always a fresh phial. He would sit upon the low rush-seated chair by the bed, and would take her thin wrist between his neat white fingers, and would count the beats of her pulse against the ticking of the silver watch that had once been his father's. He would smile softly. He would speak of the weather, of the frost, of the small progress her strength was making. He would pour a few drops of the clear liquid into a spoon of warm sweet water. He would hold it to her mouth. And Mary Thornton, her small dark eyes fixed upon his pale bright ones, would take the spoon and would swallow. She died upon the evening of the 9th day. It was the 18th of January, in the year 1854. A cold wet wind blew down the market street from the north. The bells of St. Augustine's had just struck 7. Anne was sitting upon the low chair by the bed, holding her mother's thin, cold hand in her own. The doctor stood at the foot of the bed with his silver watch in his palm. The maid was at the door with a fresh candle. And Mary Thornton drew one long, slow breath, and then another, and then a third that was quieter than the first two, and then she drew no breath at all. Her small dark eyes were open. They were still bright and hard. They were fixed upon the face of her son-in-law, at the foot of the bed, in the soft, steady light of the candle. He closed them himself, gently, with the tips of 2 neat white fingers, before he stepped back from the bed. The certificate of death was written out that same evening at the desk in the small back room. He set down the cause in his own careful, clear hand. Apoplexy. He signed his name beneath it in the fine engraved script that had by now become known in the town, at the moneylenders in London, and in the ledgers of every small clerk from whom he had borrowed £20 or £50 upon a note of hand. The vicar was sent for. The sexton was sent for. The undertaker of the town, a Mr. Bladen, came round from his shop with his measuring tape and his black book. Mary Thornton was laid out upon the bed in the front chamber in her heavy black gown, with her white cap tied beneath her chin and a folded strip of linen bound about her jaw. The small painted casket was taken from the floor beside the bed. The silver chain was lifted from her thin, cold neck. The small brass key was turned in the lock. And the will she had drawn up in Stafford some 3 weeks before, leaving everything absolutely to her daughter Anne Palmer of Rugeley, was lifted out and unfolded and read by the soft, steady light of the candle upon the desk in the small back room. Some £8,000 in the funds. A few small pieces of plate. A silver tea-urn that had once stood in the parlour of the Colonel at Stafford. A pair of small candlesticks. A gold ring set with a garnet. It was not a fortune to buy a country estate. It was not a fortune to pay off the whole of the London bills. But it was enough, and it was more than enough, to hold off the moneylenders of Chancery Lane for another season. Anne sat by the fire in the parlour with the small tin box in her lap. She lifted out the 4 small locks of hair, and she touched each one to her cheek, and she thought of the mother, lying quiet now, in the upper chamber, under the folded strip of linen. And she wept without any sound, as she had wept for each of the 4 small graves in the yard of St. Augustine's. Her husband stood at the parlour window with his hands clasped behind his back, and he looked out into the wet, dark street where the yellow light of a single gas lamp burned softly against the fog, and he did not weep at all. The funeral was held 3 days later at Stafford, in the small parish yard where the Colonel had been laid down years before. The doctor and his wife travelled in a hired chaise through the cold January dawn. The small painted casket, empty now of its papers, went with them, wrapped in a length of black cloth. And as the chaise rolled slowly out of Rugeley in the pale grey morning, past the shuttered fronts of the shops and the sleeping yard of the Talbot Arms, William Palmer sat very still beside his silent wife, with the same soft, attentive smile upon his face, and he was already turning over in his mind the small, careful sums by which the £8,000 might be laid out to answer the sharpest of the bills that lay locked in the drawer of the desk in the small back room at home. The Insured Wife. The £8,000 came into the house of the Market Street in the weeks after the funeral at Stafford. It came slowly, in the way that money always came to a man in that age, through the offices of a solicitor and the counting-house of a bank. A slip of paper here, a draft upon the funds there, a short note upon thick cream paper from the trustees, requesting a signature and a seal. William Palmer signed each paper with the same fine, clear script. He sealed each envelope with a drop of red wax pressed by his own hand. He carried the drafts into the small back room, and he laid them upon the desk beside the brown book, and he drew a long, slow breath as he did so. Then he sat, and he opened the small locked drawer, and he began to divide the sum among the sharpest of the bills. 100 to Padwick and Company in Chancery Lane, 200 to a firm called Wright of Birmingham, 50 here, 80 there. The paper of Mary Thornton, dead now under the frozen earth at Stafford, went out into the world in small brown envelopes and paid the interest upon interest that a young country doctor had been unable to meet for 3 long years. By the coming of the spring, most of it was gone. The lanes of Staffordshire greened again. The blackthorn flowered white along the hedges to Cannock. The barges upon the Trent and Mersey Canal ran full once more, and the coal smoke rose thick and grey above the roofs of Rugeley in the still soft mornings. And in the small back room upon the Market Street, William Palmer sat again with his brown book open upon his knee, and he saw that the fresh sums from Stafford had bought him only a season. The horses had lost again through the winter meetings. A mare called Goldfinder had broken down at Wolverhampton. A colt he had backed heavily at Chester had come in last of the field. The moneylenders had already begun to write again in their cramped clerks' hands, upon paper folded thrice. Fresh bills of hand had been signed. Fresh promises had been made, and the small clear eyes above the soft attentive smile went very still now in the candlelight, and turned themselves, slowly and quietly, toward the upper bedroom of the house, where a thin, pale wife sat by the fire in her heavy black, with a small tin box upon her lap. Anne was in her 30th year. She had borne 5 children in 7 years, and had buried 4 of them in the yard of St. Augustine's. She had lost her mother in the front chamber of her own house. She had grown thinner still through that winter. Her soft brown hair had begun to show a strand or two of grey at the temples. Her hands trembled a little now when she raised her teacup to her mouth. She spoke less than she had before. She sat many hours by the parlour fire with her sewing untouched in her lap, watching the small red heart of the coals. She went twice on a Sabbath to St. Augustine's, kneeling in the family pew with her white gloves folded, and she took the sacrament from the vicar's hand with her eyes shut. She loved her husband still. She had never learned to do otherwise. When he came home in the evening from a long ride, she rose from the fire and unbuttoned his coat with her own small hands and hung it upon the peg by the door. She poured his brandy and water. She sat with him at supper. She listened to him speak of the day, and when he laid his hand upon her thin shoulder, she smiled at him softly, in the way she had smiled at him at the church door at Abbots Bromley 7 years before. He set his plan going in the month of April, in the year 1854. A gentleman of Rugeley, by the name of Pratt, a solicitor who had done a little business for him before, was called into the small back room upon a wet Tuesday afternoon. The doctor sat him by the fire and poured him a glass of sherry and spoke to him with the same soft, attentive smile. He said that his young wife had been in poor health since the loss of her mother, and that he wished to make some proper provision for her against any small misfortune that the years might yet bring. He spoke of an insurance upon her life. He spoke of a sum that would answer, in the event of any sudden calamity, both for her comfort and for the future of the small son who now went daily to his grandmother's house. He spoke of a policy in the sum of £13,000. £13,000. It was, in the England of that year, a very great sum indeed. It was near 40 times the whole yearly income of a comfortable country parson. It was enough to buy a good farm and stock it, or a fine town-house in a London square, or a partnership in a solid trade. It was enough, and more than enough, to pay off every last shilling that William Palmer owed in Chancery Lane, in Birmingham, in Rugeley, and in every small back room where a note of hand had been signed upon a rainy evening these last 7 years. The solicitor Pratt sat with his glass of sherry in his thin cold fingers and heard the figure spoken in the soft calm voice, and he blinked twice, and he set the glass down upon the small round table, and he asked, in a voice as careful as he could make it, whether a sum quite so large would be thought reasonable by any of the great offices in London. The doctor smiled at him softly. He said that the matter might want a little arranging. He said the offices did not always look kindly upon a very heavy policy from a single hand. He said the sum might therefore be broken into 3, laid off upon 3 separate companies, so that no one office should feel too heavy a weight. He said the whole business could be managed quietly, through Mr. Pratt's own office, for a proper commission upon each policy. He named the offices he had in mind: the Norwich Union, the Solicitors and General, the Prince of Wales. He spoke the names in the same soft voice he had used at the sick-bed, in the same steady tone he had used at each of the 4 small burials in the yard of St. Augustine's. And Mr. Pratt, who had a wife and children of his own in a house at the edge of the town, and whose small practice depended upon such commissions as this, drew a slow breath and reached again for his glass of sherry and said he would set the papers in train. The papers took some weeks to move. Anne was called down one morning to the parlour, in a plain black gown and a white lace collar, to sign her name upon 3 sheets of thick cream foolscap. The doctor stood beside her at the writing table. He dipped the pen for her in the small silver inkstand. He guided her thin, cold hand to the place where the signature was to fall. She signed her name in a soft round script, Anne Palmer, 3 times over, upon 3 separate papers. She did not read the sums. She did not ask what the papers were for. Her husband told her only that they were a small matter of provision for the future, arranged through Mr. Pratt, and that she was a good girl to sign them without a fuss. He kissed her on the brow. He led her back to the parlour fire. He sent the maid for a cup of hot tea and a slice of buttered bread, and he took the 3 papers away into the small back room, and he laid them beside the brown book, and he closed the door softly behind him. A doctor from the offices in London came down to Rugeley in June to examine the life. He was a stout, kindly man in a black frock coat, who arrived by the mail coach at the Talbot Arms and was met at the door by Palmer in his best silk stock. He was given a good supper of cold ham and a bottle of port. He was shown up to the parlour, where Anne sat waiting in her plain black gown, with her thin, pale hands folded in her lap. He took her pulse. He listened at her chest with a wooden stethoscope. He asked her a few soft questions about her breathing and her appetite and her sleep. She answered him in her quiet, low voice. He nodded. He wrote in a small notebook. He drank another glass of port with the doctor of the house before the fire, and he spoke of the racecourses at Chester and at Shrewsbury, and he laughed at some small joke, and he went to his bed early in a room at the Talbot Arms. In the morning he took the coach back to London, carrying with him a favourable report upon the life of Mrs. Anne Palmer, aged 29, of the Market Street at Rugeley. The 3 policies were completed in August. The first year's premium was paid upon each, and the thick cream papers were folded and tied with a thin black ribbon and locked in the strong iron safe in the corner of the small back room, behind the desk where the brown book lay open. The summer passed slowly. The days were long and hot and still. Anne sat much of the day in the small walled garden behind the house, in a low wicker chair beneath a pear tree, with her sewing in her lap and a straw bonnet upon her head. The small son came in the afternoon from his grandmother's house, in a white pinafore and a wide blue sash, and he sat at her feet upon the grass, and she watched him with her thin, pale hands folded still. She had grown a little stronger in the warm weather. Her cheek had a small, faint colour in it again. She spoke a little more at the supper table. She laughed once, softly, at some small remark of the maid's, and the sound of the laugh in the low parlour surprised her so much that she stopped it at once and pressed her hand to her mouth. In September, the doctor proposed a small journey. He said his wife had been too long between the same 4 walls. He said the air of the coast would do her good. He said they would take the train from Stafford to Liverpool and would stay a few nights in a decent private hotel near the docks, and would drive out to the sands at Southport in a hired carriage. He said a change of scene would put fresh colour in her cheek and set her up for the winter to come. She was pleased. She had never seen the sea. She packed a small leather trunk with her best black silk gown and 2 plain grey day dresses and a shawl of paisley pattern. She kissed the small son at the door of the grandmother's house. She promised him a small painted shell for his mantelpiece. She climbed into the hired chaise beside her husband upon a bright September morning, and they drove away up the Stafford road under a pale blue sky, with the hedges dusty and the fields already gold with the cut stubble of the harvest. They came back 4 days later, in the late evening, by the same hired chaise. She was ill. She had been ill since the 2nd night in Liverpool. She had eaten a plate of oysters at the hotel, she said, that had not sat well upon her stomach. She had been seized in the small hours with a violent sickness and a griping in the bowels. She had lain in the strange bed in the strange room, with the foghorns sounding from the docks, and had wept softly with her face to the wall. Her husband had sat by her bedside. He had held her thin hand. He had mixed a little draught in a spoon and pressed it to her mouth. She had grown a little better by the morning. She had grown worse again by the evening. And so it had gone through the 4 days, one better, one worse, until at last he had said quietly that they must go home to Rugeley, where the air was good and the bed was her own, and where his own medicines were at hand, upon the shelf in the small back room. She was carried up the stairs to the upper bedroom that same night, in her heavy black cloak, half fainting upon her husband's arm. The maid was sent running for a fresh coal and a warming pan. Sarah Palmer came across the town from her own house, with her Bible under her arm, and stood at the foot of the bed with her stern, pale face working, and said only that the girl should have been kept at home in her own parlour, and never sent out upon the strange rails of a Liverpool train. The doctor answered her softly. He said the sickness was a common one of the season, an English cholera brought on by a bad oyster, and that a few days of rest and a spoon of his own draught would set her right. He fetched a small brown phial from the case in the back room. He poured a few drops of a clear liquid into a spoon of warm sweet water. He held it to the thin, pale mouth. Anne took it. She looked up at him from the pillow with her soft brown eyes, and she smiled at him as she had smiled at him at the church door at Abbots Bromley 7 years before. And she swallowed the draught, and she lay back upon the pillow, and she closed her eyes. For 3 days more she lay in the upper bedroom. The sickness came and went. She would sit up a little in the morning and take a spoon of thin broth from the maid's hand and speak a small quiet word about the small son and the small painted shell she had brought him from the docks. She would sink low again by the evening, and her small hands would twitch upon the quilt, and her breath would come shallow and quick. The doctor came up to her 3 times each day. He carried his small black leather bag. He carried his small brown phial. He would sit upon the low chair by the bed, and he would take her thin wrist between his neat white fingers, and he would count the beats of her pulse against the ticking of the silver watch that had once been his father's. He would smile softly. He would speak of the small progress her strength was making. He would pour a few drops of the clear liquid into a spoon of warm, sweet water, and he would hold it to her mouth, and she would take it. She died upon the evening of the 29th of September, in the year 1854. A soft rain was falling upon the roofs of the market street. The clock at St. Augustine's had struck 7. The maid stood at the door of the upper bedroom with a fresh candle. Sarah Palmer knelt at the side of the bed with her Bible open in her lap and her stern, pale face bent low. The small son had been sent to his own small bed in the grandmother's house across the town, and knew nothing yet of what was passing in the upper room. Anne drew one long slow breath, and then another, and then a third that was quieter than the first 2, and then she drew no breath at all. Her soft brown eyes were open. They were fixed upon her husband's face, at the foot of the bed, in the soft, steady light of the candle. He closed them himself, gently, with the tips of 2 neat white fingers, before he stepped back from the bed. The certificate of death was written out that same evening at the desk in the small back room. He set down the cause in his own careful, clear hand. English cholera. He signed his name beneath it in the fine engraved script that was now well known in the town. The vicar was sent for. The sexton was sent for. The undertaker, Mr. Bladen, came round with his measuring tape and his black book. Anne Palmer was laid out upon the bed in her best black silk gown, with a folded strip of linen bound about her jaw, and her thin pale hands crossed upon her breast. And in the small back room, upon the desk, beside the brown book with its columns of figures, lay 3 thick cream papers tied with a thin black ribbon, and the ink upon them was already dry, and the sum they carried was £13,000, and the doctor sat before them in the candlelight, with the same soft, attentive smile upon his face, and he did not weep, and outside the soft rain kept falling upon the roofs of the sleeping town. The brothers' bond. The £13,000 came into the house upon the market street through the autumn of that year. It came slowly, as such sums always came in that age, through the offices of a solicitor and the counting houses of 3 great London firms. The Norwich Union paid first. The solicitors and general paid second. The Prince of Wales paid last, and paid with a small, quiet grumbling in its clerk's books, for the sum was large, and the death had been sudden, and the young wife had been but 29 years old. Yet the doctor from London had signed his favourable report upon her life in the summer, and the country doctor of the town had signed his certificate of English cholera in the autumn, and the papers were in order, and the ribbon was black, and the offices paid. William Palmer took the drafts into the small back room. He laid them upon the desk beside the brown book. He drew a long, slow breath. Then he opened the small locked drawer, and he began once more to divide the money among his creditors. Padwick and Company in Chancery Lane took a heavy portion. A firm called Wright of Birmingham took another. A man called Bate took a third, and a moneylender of London called Pratt, no kin to the solicitor of the town, took a fourth. The drafts went out in small brown envelopes, sealed with red wax, addressed in the fine, clear script that was now known in every counting-house from the Trent to the Thames. By the coming of the new year, the money was again gone. It had gone as it had gone before, into the closed hands of clerks in dark offices, into the pockets of turf accountants at Wolverhampton and at Doncaster, into the strong iron safes of men who kept their books in a small, cramped hand. There had been fresh horses through the winter, a mare called Nettle, a colt called Chicken, a gelding called the Sceptre. Each had promised a fortune. Each had come home last of the field, or had broken down at the first turn, or had bolted upon the wrong side of the rail. The brown book had grown thicker. The columns had grown longer. The candles in the small back room had burned very late into the night. And so, in the spring of the year 1855, William Palmer turned his soft, attentive smile once more upon his own kin. He turned it this time upon his brother Walter. Walter Palmer was the third son of Joseph and Sarah Palmer. He was 33 years old that spring. He had been, in his boyhood, a plump, fair child with a soft laugh and a fondness for small, sweet cakes. He had grown into a heavy man, broad in the shoulder and thick in the neck, with a red face and small, watery eyes that ran a little at the corners in cold weather. He had married some years before a woman called Agnes Milcrest, a plain, sensible woman of the county, and he had set up in the corn trade in the town of Stafford. He had failed at it. He had failed at a second trade in timber. He had failed at a third in general dealing. Each failure had left him a little poorer and a little redder in the face, and each had driven him a little deeper into the brandy bottle that he carried now in the inside pocket of his coat wherever he went. His wife had left him at last, weeping upon the shoulder of her own mother, and had gone home to her own people in another part of the county. Walter had taken lodgings at Stafford, in a small back room above a public house called the Grapes, and he lived there alone with his brandy and his failing colour, and his small watery eyes. William Palmer rode into Stafford one bright March morning to visit his brother. He wore his best dark broadcloth coat and his silk hat. He tied his horse in the yard of the Grapes. He climbed the narrow wooden stair to the small back room. He found Walter sitting by a cold grate in his shirt sleeves, unshaven, with a bottle and a smeared glass upon a table beside him. The doctor was not shocked. He had known his brother a long time. He drew up the other chair. He asked after Walter's health in a soft, attentive voice. He asked after his purse. He asked whether a small loan of a few pounds would ease the week. Walter looked up at him from the watery eyes and nodded slowly, and did not speak, and reached again for the smeared glass. The two brothers sat by the cold grate for a long space that morning. William spoke gently. He said the world had been unkind to Walter. He said the corn trade had been a hard trade, and the timber trade harder still. He said a man of Walter's age must think of his future. He said a man in Walter's condition, alone in a small back room, must think of what he would leave behind him. He spoke of insurance. He said it was a matter easily arranged. He said he himself would pay every premium, from his own purse, for so long as the policies should stand. He said the sum would come to Walter's own name, and would give him credit at the bank, and would set him on his feet again. He said, softly, that if any small calamity should carry Walter off in the meantime, the sum should return to the family, so that no small son of William's should be left without provision. Walter listened. He wiped his mouth on the back of his hand. He nodded once, heavily, and said the doctor knew best of these things, and he would sign whatever paper was put before him. The papers were drawn up in the following weeks. William rode out again to Stafford with the same solicitor Pratt of Rugeley. They sat with Walter in the small back room above the grapes. They spread the thick cream papers upon the table beside the bottle. Walter signed each one in a heavy, sprawling hand that could not always keep upon the line. The sums were large, larger than the sums that had been laid upon Anne. William Palmer meant this time to end the matter in one blow. He had signed his brother's life to the offices of London for a total of some £82,000. It was a sum so large that it took the breath of the solicitor Pratt when he added it up in his own small book at the end of the long day. It was a sum that would have bought a country estate of the finest sort, with a park and a shooting and a farm of many hundred acres, and would have left a great heap of shining coin over. The offices, when the papers went in, did not swallow the matter easily. They asked for a doctor's examination of the life. William Palmer arranged it. A stout physician came down from London by the mail coach and was met at the Talbot Arms in Rugeley by William himself in his best silk stock. He was given a good supper of cold ham and a bottle of port. He was driven the next morning in the doctor's own dog-cart the short road to Stafford. He was shown up to the small back room above the grapes, where Walter had been dressed by his brother's own hand in a clean linen shirt and a decent coat, and where the bottle had been hidden behind the washstand, and where a fresh fire had been laid in the grate with a shovel of coal. The physician took Walter's heavy red hand. He listened at the broad chest with a wooden stethoscope. He asked a few soft questions about the appetite and the sleep. Walter answered in a low, steady voice, coached beforehand by his brother, and did not once reach for the washstand. The physician wrote a few lines in his small notebook. He nodded. He drank another glass of port with William before the fire at the Talbot Arms that evening, and he laughed at some small joke, and he took the coach back to London in the morning. The report was not, this time, as favourable as it had been for Anne. The stout physician wrote in his notebook that the life was a heavy drinker of ardent spirits, that the face was very red, and that the small, watery eyes suggested a habit of long standing. The officers of London read the report. They shook their heads over it. Some declined the risk altogether. Others accepted only a small portion of the sum proposed. In the end, of the £82,000 William Palmer had sought upon his brother's life, only some 14,000 were carried through. It was a bitter figure to him. It was less than had come from Anne. It would not answer the whole of the fresh bills that had come in through the winter. Yet it was still a very great sum by any common measure, and it was still worth the taking. William paid the first year's premium upon each policy from the last of the money that had come out of the 13,000 of Anne, and the papers were folded and tied with a thin black ribbon, and locked in the strong iron safe in the corner of the small back room, behind the desk where the brown book lay open. The summer of that year passed hot and slow. The lanes of Staffordshire were white with dust. The barges upon the canal moved sluggishly through green water. William Palmer rode out often to Stafford. He carried with him always a small case of glass phials, and always a fresh bottle of good brandy for his brother, and always a small purse of shillings for the landlord of the grapes. He would sit for long hours with Walter in the small back room, pouring the brandy with his own hand, glass for glass, encouraging him to drink deep. He would smile softly. He would speak of old boyhood days at the brick house on the market street, of their mother Sarah, of their long-dead father Joseph, of the timber yard by the church. Walter would drink. His red face would grow redder. His small watery eyes would run more freely at the corners. He would drink until his heavy head sank upon the table, and then William would rise, and would smooth his brother's shirt collar with a neat white hand, and would go softly down the narrow wooden stair, and would ride home to Rugeley through the dust of the summer evening. The end came upon a Sunday. It was the 14th of August, in the year 1855. A hot, still day. The bells of the churches in Stafford had long since ceased their morning ringing. The streets were quiet. The Grapes was closed by law upon the Sabbath, but the private door at the back stood open, and William Palmer had come through it with his black leather bag and a fresh bottle of brandy under his arm. He had come to sit with his brother, he told the landlord, for a small, quiet visit. He had climbed the narrow stair. He had entered the small back room, and he had shut the door softly behind him. What passed in that room through the long hot afternoon, no living voice can now say for certain. The landlord heard upon the stair the low murmur of William's voice, and the heavier answer of Walter's, and the clink of a glass upon a glass, and once a soft, short laugh. The bells of St. Mary's rang out for the evening service. The bells fell silent. The clock in the taproom below struck 7. The clock struck 8. The clock struck 9. And then, a little after 9, the door of the small back room opened, and William Palmer came softly down the narrow wooden stair, and stood in the taproom door in his best silk stock, and said in a low, calm voice that his brother had been taken in a fit, and that a message must be sent for the town doctor at once. The town doctor came within the hour. He climbed the narrow wooden stair. He found Walter Palmer lying upon the bed in his shirt-sleeves, his red face turned to the ceiling, his small watery eyes half open, his heavy chest still. An empty glass stood upon the table beside him. An empty bottle stood upon the floor. William Palmer sat upon the low chair by the bed, with his black leather bag at his feet, and the same soft, attentive smile upon his face. He said that his poor brother had drunk too deep and too fast in the heat of the afternoon. He said the heart, long weakened by ardent spirits, had given out at the last. He said it was a common enough end for a man of Walter's habits. He said he had done all that could be done. The town doctor bent over the body. He lifted a heavy eyelid. He laid his hand upon the still chest. He nodded slowly. He said he could not disagree. The certificate of death was written out that same evening. The cause was set down as apoplexy, brought on by intemperance. William Palmer stood by the desk and watched the town doctor sign it in a hand less fine than his own. The undertaker was sent for. The bells of St. Mary's rang out again in the hot, still night, tolling for a heavy man of 33 summers, who had been born in a small brick house upon the market street of Rugeley, and had died in a small back room above a public house in Stafford. William Palmer rode home through the dark lanes in his best silk stock, with the moon riding low above the fields of stubble, and he was already turning over in his mind the small, careful sums by which the £14,000 might be laid out to answer the sharpest of the fresh bills that lay locked in the drawer of the desk, in the small back room upon the market street. Yet this time the money did not come. The offices of London had grown quiet in their counting-houses. Word had passed among the clerks. A young country doctor of Staffordshire had lost, in the space of 18 short months, a mother-in-law, a wife, and now a brother, each insured for a great sum, each certified in his own careful, clear hand, or in the hand of a country colleague at his side. The clerks turned the papers over in their thin, cold fingers. They looked at the fine engraved script upon the signatures. They laid the papers aside. They wrote back to Rugeley in polite short notes upon thick cream paper, requesting further inquiries, requesting the attendance of their own physicians, requesting a delay upon the payment while certain small matters were considered. And in the small back room upon the market street, William Palmer read the notes by candlelight, and the soft, attentive smile did not quite leave his face, but his pale, bright eyes grew very still indeed, and he sat late that night, with the brown book open upon his knee, and outside the last warm rain of the summer began to fall upon the sleeping roofs of the town. The Shrewsbury Races. The autumn wore itself out slowly upon the fields of Staffordshire. The last of the harvest went into the barns at Cannock and at Blithfield. The rooks came down in great black flocks upon the ploughed brown earth. The mornings turned raw and grey. In the small back room upon the market street, William Palmer sat many long hours by the fire with his brown book open upon his knee. The offices of London had grown very quiet upon the matter of Walter. The polite short notes upon thick cream paper had come and had gone. No draft for £14,000 had followed. The small locked drawer of the desk grew fat once more with fresh demands. Padwick and Company had written twice. Wright of Birmingham had written thrice. A man called Bate had sent a clerk down to Rugeley in a shabby brown coat, and the clerk had put up at the Talbot Arms, and had called at the surgery 3 days in a row, and had gone away each day with a fresh bill of hand signed in the same fine, clear script. There were, by the calling of that November, some £12,000 owing upon the doctor's name. Some of it stood at usurious interest, at £40 and even £60 upon the 100. Some of it stood upon bills that would fall due before the year turned. And one small piece of it, no more than £1,000, stood upon a signature that was not, in any strict truth, the doctor's own to give. It was the signature of his mother. It was the name of Sarah Palmer, widow, of the Market Street at Rugeley, written in the same neat, clear hand as every other, upon a note of hand drawn to answer a heavy loss at the Wolverhampton meeting. She did not know. She had not seen the paper. She sat in her own brick house across the town with her Bible upon her knee and her small silver crucifix upon her breast, and she believed her son to be a rising country doctor, lately widowed, whose small son played upon her hearthrug of an afternoon. Into this narrowing hour, in the first week of November, in the year 1855, came the meeting at Shrewsbury. Shrewsbury was a town of some 20,000 souls upon the great slow bend of the River Severn, 40 miles to the west of Rugeley, in the county of Shropshire. The races were run each November upon a strip of green turf beyond the town walls, at a place called Monkmoor. The meeting drew gentlemen from all the counties of the west. It drew bookmakers from London and from Manchester. It drew touts and tipsters and small quiet men in long coats who lived by other men's losses. Palmer had ridden to Shrewsbury each November for many years. He knew every face in the betting ring. He knew every horse in every stall. He carried his small brown book in the inside pocket of his coat, and his silver pencil looped upon a slender cord, and a purse of what money he could still lay hand upon. He travelled to Shrewsbury upon the Monday of that meeting week in the company of a friend. The friend was a young man called John Parsons Cook. Cook was 28 years old that autumn. He was slim and pale and gentle, with soft brown hair and a small neat moustache. He had been reared as the son of a respectable family in the county of Worcestershire. He had trained for the law and had been called to it, but he had never practised, for a small legacy of some £15,000 had come to him upon his coming of age, and he had turned it, over the years, into a small string of racing horses. He kept them at a training yard at Hednesford, near Rugeley. He came often to the town on matters of the turf. He had lodged frequently at the Talbot Arms opposite the doctor's house. He had drunk many a small glass of brandy and water, with Palmer, in the parlour of that inn on winter evenings. He trusted the doctor. He liked him. He called him, in the easy way of the racecourse, by his Christian name. Cook had upon that November 2 horses entered at Shrewsbury. One was a colt called Sirius. The other was a small dark mare called Polestar. The colt was thought little of. The mare was thought less. She was small in the flank and short in the leg. She had run 3 times that season and had finished nowhere. Cook, in his soft, attentive way, believed in her still. He had trained her himself through the autumn. He had watched her at gallop upon the fields at Hednesford in the pale grey dawns. He had felt, he said, something under her small dark quarters that no man in the betting ring had yet felt. He had entered her for the Shrewsbury handicap upon the Tuesday of the meeting, and he had laid his own money upon her, quietly, at long odds, through several small books. Palmer and Cook rode out to Shrewsbury upon a wet November morning. They travelled by the train from Stafford, in a first-class carriage with a small oil lamp burning in the roof, and a folded blanket upon each knee. They put up at the Raven Hotel upon the castle foregate. They took a supper of roast fowl and a bottle of port in the coffee-room, and they spoke of the mare Polestar, and of the going upon the turf at Monkmoor, and of the small chances of the colt Sirius. They went early to bed. The rain tapped upon the windows of the Raven through the small hours, and in the morning the sun came up, pale and cold, upon a country white with a hard frost. Tuesday of the Shrewsbury meeting was a bright, still day. The frost held into the noon. The turf at Monkmoor rang under the hoofs of the horses like a struck bell. The betting ring filled slowly through the morning. Gentlemen in dark coats and tall silk hats moved along the rail. Bookmakers cried the odds in loud, rough voices. Small boys ran to and fro with folded slips of paper. The mare Polestar was entered for the handicap in the early afternoon. She was quoted in the ring at long odds of some 20 to 1 against. Cook laid his money upon her by the pound and by the £10 and by the £50. Palmer watched him. Palmer did not lay upon Polestar. Palmer laid upon a favourite of the field, a colt called the River, at short odds for a heavy stake. Palmer wanted a small sure winning. He had bills to pay. The handicap was run at 3 of the clock. The horses filed out of the paddock in their bright silks. Polestar carried Cook's own colours of pale blue and white. She was ridden by a small hard boy of 15 years, a stable lad called Fisher, in a pale blue cap. The field went off in a scatter of hooves and a rise of steam, and the crowd along the rail lifted a low, steady roar. The River ran up front in the early strides. The favourite. The safe bet. Palmer stood at the rail with his silver pencil in his hand and the small brown book pressed against his chest, and he watched the colours pass at the turn. The River broke down at the second turn. He struck a soft place in the frozen turf. He stumbled. He fell back through the field. Palmer's soft, attentive smile did not change, but the silver pencil in his neat white hand pressed a small, hard mark upon the leather of the little book. And out of the scattered field, upon the long straight run to the post, the small dark mare Polestar came through the leaders with a soft, steady stride, her pale blue cap climbing above the shoulders of the taller horses, and Fisher, upon her back, rode her out with a still hand and a quiet crop, and she took the post by a length and a half, to the astonishment of the ring. The crowd along the rail lifted a shout. The bookmakers turned pale and reached for their little books. Cook stood by the rail, with his small neat moustache trembling upon his lip, and tears standing in his soft brown eyes. He had won, in that one short race upon a strip of frozen turf at Monkmoor, some £2,000 in ready gold and drafts, and he was still owed as much again from books yet to settle. Palmer had lost. Palmer had lost heavily. He had laid some £800 upon the River, and it had gone in the space of a single stride into the pocket of another man. He stood at the rail with the same soft, attentive smile upon his face, and he closed the small brown book softly, and he slipped the silver pencil into his waistcoat pocket, and he turned to his friend Cook, and he took him by the arm, and he congratulated him warmly upon the fortune of his mare. The evening of that Tuesday was long and loud at the Raven Hotel. Cook stood a supper for a party of racing friends in the coffee-room. There was a great joint of roast beef upon the sideboard. There were bottles of champagne in ice buckets upon the floor. There were plates of oysters and lobster brought up from the docks. Cook sat at the head of the table with his soft, flushed face and his soft brown hair a little disordered, and he laughed easily at every small joke, and he pressed the wine upon his friends with a full hand. Palmer sat at his right side. Palmer drank little. Palmer laughed at every joke of Cook's. Palmer refilled Cook's glass with his own neat white hand. Late in the evening, when the coffee-room had thinned and the candles had burned low, Cook rose and swayed a little upon his feet, and pressed a hand to his brow. He said the wine had gone to his head. He said he felt a small, strange sickness upon him. Palmer led him upstairs by the elbow. He put him to bed in his own room at the Raven. He sat by him for a small quarter of an hour. He mixed a light draught in a glass of hot brandy and water, and pressed it to the pale lips. Cook took it. Cook slept, and Palmer went softly down the stair to the coffee-room again, and paid off the last of Cook's bill from Cook's own purse, and slipped the purse itself into the inside pocket of his coat, and drank a small glass of soda water, and went himself at last to his own bed. The two men stayed at Shrewsbury through the Wednesday and the Thursday of the meeting. Cook's mare had won. Cook's colt Sirius was scratched. Cook spent much of the Wednesday going about the ring settling with the bookmakers. He gathered his gold and his drafts into a small leather satchel that he carried under his arm. He did not, being a young man of the racecourse, put the gold at once into a bank. He meant to carry it home with him to Rugeley, and to lay it aside there against his winter running. Palmer walked with him along the ring. Palmer watched each small transfer of coin. Palmer noted the sums. Palmer had, by the Thursday evening, a very fair notion of what lay in the small leather satchel of his friend John Parsons Cook. It was not less than £2,000 in gold and paper, and it was as much again in bills of hand upon the bookmakers, still to be presented at their London offices in the coming week. Upon the Thursday night, at the Raven, Cook fell ill a second time. It came upon him at the supper table, after a glass of brandy, that Palmer had himself mixed at the sideboard. He rose from his chair. He pressed a hand to his stomach. He said the brandy had a strange taste upon it, a bitter taste that clung upon the back of the tongue. Palmer smiled softly. He said the water at Shrewsbury was known to be hard, and that the barmaid had likely drawn a bad measure. He led Cook once more up the stair. He put him to bed. He sat by him with a small brown phial in his neat white hand. Others in the coffee-room had heard the small remark upon the bitter taste. A gentleman called Ismail Fisher, no kin to the stable lad but a bookmaker of Manchester, had been at the supper table that night. He remembered the words afterward. He remembered how Cook had risen white to the lips. He remembered how Palmer had smiled softly and led him from the room. He remembered how the glass upon the table had stood half full, and how the mixture in it had smelled a little strange when he had bent his own nose to it after they had gone. He did not, upon that Thursday night, do anything. He drank his port and paid his bill, and went at last to his bed. But he did not, either, forget. Cook was a little better by the Friday morning. He came down to the coffee-room in his soft brown suit, pale still about the cheek, with his soft brown eyes very tired. He took a little tea and a slice of dry toast. He said he must be getting home to Rugeley. He said the small leather satchel must be laid safe at his lodging. He said he owed himself a quiet week by his own fire. Palmer, sitting across from him at the table in his best silk stock, agreed. He said he would travel back with Cook that very day. He said the two of them would take the afternoon train together from Shrewsbury to Stafford, and would ride together on the branch line thence to Rugeley, and would be at their own doors before the light had gone out of the sky. They travelled that afternoon in a first-class carriage upon the Western Railway. A small oil lamp burned in the roof. A folded blanket lay upon each knee. The country slid past the windows in a long, slow procession of grey field and grey wood and grey hedge. Cook sat with the small leather satchel upon his lap. His neat white hands rested upon it. His soft brown eyes closed sometimes for a little space, and then opened again. Palmer sat opposite him in his best silk stock, with his silver watch chain across his waistcoat, and the same soft, attentive smile upon his face. He watched his friend. He watched the small leather satchel. He watched the long grey country roll past the window. And in his mind he was already turning over, in the same neat, clear script that had signed every certificate and every note of hand these long 7 years, the small, careful arrangement by which the £2,000 of gold upon the satchel and the £2,000 of paper still to be gathered in London might yet be brought to answer the sharpest of the bills that lay locked in the drawer of the desk in the small back room upon the market street. The train pulled into Stafford at dusk. The two men took the small branch line thence to Rugeley. They came into the station of the town in the last pale grey of the evening. A porter carried their small trunks out into the yard. A single gas lamp burned above the door of the Talbot Arms. The bells of St. Augustine's struck 7 above the sleeping roofs. Cook, weary still and pale about the cheek, walked the short distance up the market street upon Palmer's arm. He carried the small leather satchel himself, tight against his side. He would lodge, he said, this night at the Talbot Arms opposite the doctor's house, for the fire at his own rooms had likely gone out. Palmer agreed. He led his friend across the cobbles. He saw him into the door of the inn. He spoke a soft word to the landlady, a Mrs. Brooks, a stout, kind woman in a white apron. He said his friend was a little tired from the journey. He said a fire in the best bedroom, and a light supper of arrowroot, and a small glass of hot brandy would set him right by the morning. Mrs. Brooks nodded. She led Cook to the wooden stair. Palmer stood a moment in the door of the Talbot Arms. He watched his friend climb slowly, one hand upon the banister, the small leather satchel tight against his side. He watched him vanish into the shadow of the upper landing. He tipped his hat softly to Mrs. Brooks. He turned. He crossed the cobbles of the market street in the last grey light of the evening. He let himself into his own house with his own key. He walked down the narrow hall to the small back room. He shut the door softly behind him. He lit the candle upon the desk, and in the low, steady flame he opened the small locked drawer and drew out from beneath a folded bundle of London bills a small brown phial with a plain white label, and he set it upright upon the desk beside the brown book, and he sat down in the chair, and he did not smile at all. The death at the Talbot Arms. The candle in the small back room burned steady through the first slow hour of the night. The brown phial stood upright upon the desk beside the brown book. It was a plain small thing, no taller than a man's thumb, with a plain white label, and upon the label a single word had been written in the fine clear script that was now known upon so many papers in so many small back rooms of the country. The word was strychnine. Palmer sat before it for a long space. He did not touch it. He did not lift it. He watched it in the low, steady flame, as a man might watch a small, quiet flame upon a low, burning wick. Then, quite at last, he rose from the chair. He took up the phial in his neat, white hand. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. He blew out the candle, and he crossed the cobbles of the market street once more, in the raw November dark, and let himself softly into the door of the Talbot Arms opposite his own house. Mrs. Brooks, the landlady, met him in the low-panelled hall. She held a small brass chamber-stick in her red hand. She said Mr. Cook had eaten a little arrowroot and had drunk his hot brandy and was already turned to the wall. She said he had complained a little of a griping in the stomach. She said she had covered him with a second warm quilt. Palmer smiled softly at her. He said he would look in upon his friend for a small quarter of an hour, being a doctor, and being close by, and being one who knew Mr. Cook's small habits of health better than any man in the town. Mrs. Brooks nodded. She handed him the chamber-stick. She turned to her own door beside the tap-room, and Palmer climbed the wooden stair softly, one careful tread after another, with the small brass chamber-stick held before him, and the plain brown phial pressing quiet against his ribs. The best bedroom of the Talbot Arms lay upon the first floor at the front of the inn. It looked down upon the market street and across at the doctor's own black-painted door. It was a plain low chamber with a heavy tester bed, a small round table by the window, a wardrobe of dark oak, and a low chair with a rush seat set beside the fire. A small coal fire burned red in the grate. A single candle burned upon the mantel. And in the bed, under a heavy quilt and a folded shawl, lay John Parsons Cook, his soft brown hair damp upon his brow, his soft brown eyes half closed, his neat white hands resting upon the coverlet before him. The small leather satchel, still tight with its gold and its papers, lay upon the low chair beside the bed within the reach of his fingers. Palmer set the brass chamber-stick upon the small round table. He drew up the low chair. He sat down beside his friend. He took the thin, cold wrist between his neat white fingers. He counted the beats of the pulse against the ticking of the silver watch that had once been his father's. He smiled softly. He spoke of the good mare Polestar, and of the fine winning of the Tuesday past, and of the small, quiet week to come by their own firesides at Rugeley. Cook opened his soft brown eyes. He smiled a little. He said the arrowroot had a strange taste upon it, a bitter taste that clung upon the back of the tongue. Palmer nodded gently. He said the arrowroot of a country inn was often ill-made, and that Mrs. Brooks had a heavy hand upon the nutmeg. He said a small draught of his own would set the stomach at ease before the night was out. He rose. He crossed to the small round table. He turned his back to the bed. He drew the brown phial from the inside pocket of his coat. He drew out from the same pocket a folded twist of paper. He measured with a hand as steady as a hand may be in this world, a small quantity of a fine white powder into a spoon of hot sweetened water from the jug that stood beside the fire. He turned. He came back to the bedside. He smiled at his friend. He held the spoon to the pale lips. Cook took it. He swallowed. He lay back upon the pillow. He closed his eyes. Palmer sat by him for a small quarter of an hour longer. He watched the slow, steady rise of the quilt above the narrow chest. He watched the soft brown hair damp upon the brow. He did not speak. When the clock in the hall below struck 10, he rose softly, and picked up the brass chamber stick, and left the room upon the tips of his boots, and closed the door quietly behind him. He went down the wooden stair. He handed the chamber stick back to Mrs. Brooks with a soft, attentive smile. He said his friend was sleeping now, and would be right by the morning. He crossed the cobbles of the market street once more to his own door. The scream came a little after midnight. Mrs. Brooks heard it from her own bedroom at the back of the inn. It was a high, thin cry, a cry such as she had never heard from any living throat in all her years upon the market street. It was followed by another. It was followed by the heavy sound of a body arching against a wooden bed frame, and by the low rasping of a breath drawn through a locked jaw. Mrs. Brooks rose from her bed. She threw a shawl about her shoulders. She lit a candle. She ran along the passage in her bare feet, and up the wooden stair, and pushed open the door of the best bedroom. The candle upon the mantel had burned low. The fire in the grate had sunk to red embers, and upon the bed, thrown backward across the pillow with his soft brown hair wet against his brow, lay John Parsons' cook, in a shape that no living man should ever have to hold. His body was bent as a strung bow is bent. His heels pressed hard into the mattress. His head pressed hard into the pillow. His neat white hands were clenched to the palms until the knuckles stood out white as small bones. His jaw was locked. His teeth were bared. His soft brown eyes were open and staring, and they did not turn upon Mrs. Brooks when she came in, and they did not turn upon the candle in her hand, and they did not turn upon the small warm room. They stared at the ceiling as at something very far away, and something coming very close, and Mrs. Brooks pressed her free hand hard against her mouth, and stood a moment upon the threshold, with her breath stopped in her throat. She sent the boot boy at once across the cobbles for the doctor. Palmer came within 3 minutes. He came in his shirt-sleeves, with a candle in one hand and his black leather bag in the other. He climbed the wooden stair without haste. He entered the room. He set the candle upon the small round table. He bent above his friend upon the bed. He took the clenched wrist between his neat white fingers. He counted the beats against the ticking of the silver watch. He straightened. He turned to Mrs. Brooks. He said, in the same soft, attentive voice he had used at every sick-bed of his life, that the fit was a form of tetanus brought on by excitement and by the fatigue of the journey, and that a small draught of his own would ease it presently. He mixed a light draught in a spoon. He held it to the locked jaw. The jaw did not open. The lips did not part. The soft brown eyes did not turn from the ceiling. And Cook, after a small further arching of the back and a small further clenching of the hands, sank slowly back upon the pillow and drew a low, ragged breath, and did not draw another for a long space, and then did draw another, weak and slow, and then another after that. He lived out the night. He was quieter by the small hours. The clenched hands loosened. The locked jaw opened a little. Palmer sat by him upon the low chair with the same soft, attentive smile, and mixed him a spoon of hot, sweetened water from time to time, and pressed it to the pale mouth, and Cook took it without seeing him, and swallowed. Mrs. Brooks stood at the door in her shawl and her bare feet with a fresh candle in her hand. She did not go back to her own bed. She could not have gone if she had tried. She stood and watched, and prayed the small country prayers her mother had taught her, and once she wept a little into the corner of her shawl. By the grey coming of the morning, Cook was quieter still. He slept a little. He woke and looked about the room, and did not seem to know it. He asked once for a glass of water, and Palmer held it to his mouth. He asked, in a low, broken voice, what had passed with him in the night. Palmer smiled softly. He said the fit had been a small one. He said it had come of the fatigue of the racecourse and the strange bed of an inn. He said it would not come again. He sat by his friend all through that Saturday. He allowed no other doctor to attend. He allowed no fresh food to be brought up from the kitchen. He mixed each spoon of arrowroot and each spoon of broth himself, at the small round table by the window, with his back to the bed. He mixed the drinks himself. He held them to the pale lips. And Cook, weak and grateful and half asleep, took each spoon from the hand of the man he called his friend. Through the Saturday and into the Sunday it went on so. Cook grew a little stronger by day. He slept a little at night. He spoke of the Mayor Polestar in a low, tired voice, and of his winnings, and of the small leather satchel that still lay upon the low chair beside the bed. He asked Palmer, once, to hold the satchel safe for him, being a doctor and being a friend and being near at hand. Palmer took it up in his neat white hands. He weighed it once. He set it aside upon the small round table by the candle. He said it should be laid safe within the strong iron safe in the small back room of his own house across the cobbles, at Cook's own service, the moment Cook should call for it. Cook nodded weakly upon his pillow and closed his soft brown eyes and slept. On the Sunday afternoon, Palmer rode out of Rugeley to London. He rode by the train from Stafford. He carried in the inside pocket of his coat a small paper of Cook's bills of hand upon those bookmakers who had not yet paid over their losses upon the mare. He carried also a written note from Cook, weak but signed in a soft round script, requesting that Dr. Palmer be paid the sums in his stead. He came to London by the evening. He walked the offices of Tattersall's in the first light of the Monday morning. He drew the money into his own name from 6 separate books. He drew it in gold and in paper. He drew, in all, some £700. He carried it back with him upon the return train to Stafford that same afternoon. He walked into his own back room upon the market street of Rugeley in the late evening. He laid the money upon the desk beside the brown book. He did not, in any part of it, lay it in the strong iron safe against the call of the sick man across the cobbles. He crossed at once to the Talbot Arms in the raw November night. He found his friend a little worse again. Cook had grown restless in the afternoon. He had complained of the taste of a broth. He had spoken of a strange tightness about the throat. Mrs. Brooks was standing at the bedside in her white apron with a worried face. She had sent, upon her own thought, for a second doctor of the town, a Mr. Bamford, the old grey physician who had kept his ground in Rugeley these 40 years. Mr. Bamford was already in the room in his heavy black coat, an old thin man with pale watery eyes and a small tobacco stain upon his cravat. He was bending above the bed. Palmer smiled softly at him. He shook his hand. He praised him warmly for coming. He said the two of them together would set the poor young man upon his legs by the morning. Mr. Bamford peered up at him doubtfully over his small brass spectacles, and said the case was a strange one, and that he did not, in his own long practice, remember the like of it upon any patient of his own. The two doctors mixed a fresh draught between them. Mr. Bamford wrote out the recipe upon a small slip of paper in a shaky old hand. It was a plain draught of the ordinary sort, a little rhubarb, a little morphia, in a spoon of hot water. Mr. Bamford himself mixed it upon the small round table by the candle. He held it to the pale lips. Cook took it. He seemed a little easier. He slept a little. Mr. Bamford went home to his own house at the corner of the churchyard, saying he would come again in the morning. Palmer sat on by his friend upon the low rush-seated chair. It was in the deep of that Monday night that Cook died. The clock at St. Augustine's had struck 12. The candle upon the mantel had burned low again. Mrs. Brooks had slipped away to her own bedroom for a small hour of rest. And Palmer, alone by the bed, drew a small folded twist of paper from the inside pocket of his coat. He measured, with the same steady hand as before, a small quantity of a fine white powder into a spoon of hot sweetened water at the small round table by the window. He turned. He came back to the bedside. He held the spoon to the soft brown mouth. Cook, weak and half asleep, and trusting his friend even in the hour of his last darkness, took the spoon. He swallowed. He lay back upon the pillow. The scream this time was not a scream. It was a low rising cry, a slow-drawn animal cry, that grew and grew until it filled the small low room. Cook's body arched from heel to head. His heels pressed hard into the mattress. His head pressed hard into the pillow. His neat white hands clenched to the palms. His jaw locked. His teeth bared. His soft brown eyes stood wide upon the ceiling, and this time they saw the thing that was coming, and this time it did not stop. He arched once. He arched a second time. He drew one long, slow, rattling breath at the end of the second arching, and he drew no other after it. The soft brown eyes did not close. The clenched hands did not loosen. He lay upon the pillow rigid as a struck bow that has been strung and then abandoned. Palmer sat by him for a long space. He watched the last small tremor pass out of the neat white fingers. He watched the soft brown eyes stare at the far ceiling. He rose at last. He crossed to the small round table. He rinsed the spoon in the china basin. He wiped it dry upon a small square of linen from his own pocket. He tucked the brown phial back into the inside of his coat. He blew out the candle upon the mantel. He picked up the small leather satchel from the low chair beside the bed and slipped it under his own arm. He crossed the low room. He closed the door softly behind him. He went down the wooden stair. He crossed the cobbles of the market street in the raw November dark. He let himself into his own house with his own key. And in the small back room, by the light of the candle upon the desk, he set the small leather satchel beside the brown book, and he sat down in the chair, and outside the first cold rain of the winter began to fall upon the sleeping roofs of the town. The trial and the scaffold. The cold rain that had begun to fall upon the roofs of the market street did not stop through the Tuesday. It fell all through that day, soft and grey and steady, upon the black-painted door of the doctor's house, and upon the whitewashed front of the Talbot Arms opposite. Behind the wooden shutters of the best bedroom of the inn, John Parsons' cook lay quiet at last, his soft brown eyes closed now by Mrs. Brooks's own trembling hand, his neat white fingers folded upon his breast, a folded strip of linen bound about his jaw. He was 28 years old. He had won a race upon a small dark mare 6 days before. He was, when the news of his death reached his mother's house in Worcestershire, still owed a great sum of money by the bookmakers of London. His stepfather came down at once. His name was William Vernon Stevens. He was a grey, stiff man in a heavy black coat, retired from the trade of a city merchant, with sharp, small eyes and a slow, careful tongue. He arrived at the Talbot Arms upon the Wednesday evening in a hired chaise from the Stafford station. He asked, in his slow, careful voice, for the room of the dead man. He was shown up the wooden stair. He stood a long moment at the foot of the bed with his hat in his hand. He looked upon the still white face upon the pillow. He turned to the doctor from the house opposite, who stood at his side in a soft, attentive silence. He asked, quietly, what had killed his son. Palmer said the death had been a tetanus, brought on by the excitement of the racecourse and the fatigue of a long journey. He spoke with the same gentle smile he had worn at every sick-bed of his life. But William Vernon Stevens was not a countryman. He had spent 40 years among the ledgers and the counting-houses of the City of London, and he had learned in that hard school to read a man's face by the small movements at the corners of the eyes. He did not answer. He asked, instead, for the small leather satchel that his son had carried home from Shrewsbury. Palmer said the satchel was in his own safe across the cobbles, for safety. Stevens asked for it to be brought over. Palmer went and returned with it. Stevens opened it. It held a few small papers and a handful of loose shillings. The gold was gone. The bookmaker's bills were gone. The written note that had authorised Dr. Palmer to draw the sums in London had gone with them. Stevens closed the satchel. He drew a long, slow breath. He said, in the same slow, careful voice, that a post-mortem examination would be held. Palmer smiled softly. He said the country doctors would find nothing but a tetanus. He offered to be present himself. He offered to procure the surgeons. He offered a small purse of coins to the coach that would carry the body home. But William Vernon Stevens shook his grey head, once, and said the matter would go forward in the proper way, and the coroner of the district would be sent for, and the surgeons would come from Stafford, and the doctor of Rugeley would stand aside. The post-mortem was held in the best bedroom of the Talbot Arms upon the Saturday. 2 young surgeons came out from Stafford Infirmary. They opened the body upon a scrubbed pine door laid across 2 chairs. They removed the stomach and the intestines and placed them into a stone jar. They tied the mouth of the jar with a bladder. They sealed it with tape and with red wax. And as the jar was being carried from the room in the hands of the elder surgeon, a soft accident occurred at the door. A gentleman in a dark coat, standing close in the passage, brushed against the jar and set it rocking. The elder surgeon looked up. The gentleman was Dr. Palmer of Rugeley. He begged pardon. He said the passage was narrow. He stepped aside. The surgeon carried the jar past him and down the wooden stair. He noted, when he came to lay the jar upon the seat of the chaise, that the seal upon the tape had been broken, and that a small quantity of the fluid within was gone. That accident, which the doctor of Rugeley had thought so small a thing, was the first cold breath of the wind that would carry him at last to a scaffold. The elder surgeon wrote it down in his notebook. He wrote it down that same evening in his lodging at the Talbot Arms. He wrote it down again in his report to the coroner of the district. And when the stone jar reached the laboratory of the great chemist Dr. Alfred Swain Taylor in London, and when Dr. Taylor set to work upon the small quantity of contents that had survived the accident in the passage, he set to work with a mind that had already been told a strange story about a gentleman in a dark coat. The coroner opened an inquest at the Talbot Arms in the second week of December. It sat for a fortnight. It heard Mrs. Brooks, the landlady, and the boot boy, and the chambermaids, and Mr. Bamford, the old grey physician, and Ismail Fisher, the bookmaker of Manchester, who had remembered the strange bitter taste of a brandy upon a Thursday night at the Raven. It heard the elder surgeon speak of the small accident in the passage. It heard, at last, Dr. Alfred Swain Taylor come down from London by the train, speak in a slow, patient voice of what he had found within the small quantity that had reached his laboratory. He had not found the poison itself, for the poison was of a kind that leaves little trace, and the quantity had been small before he had received it. But he had found no natural cause for the death of a young man of 28, and he had found the small signs of an unnatural agent upon the tissues, and he told the coroner, in his slow, patient voice, that in his own judgment the death was the death of strychnine. The verdict of the coroner's jury came in upon the 26th of the month. It named William Palmer, surgeon of the Market Street at Rugeley, as the wilful murderer of John Parsons' cook. He was already in the county gaol at Stafford, held upon a small charge of debt, so that he might not run. He was moved that same night to a stronger cell. The exhumations followed within days. On a grey December morning, the sexton of St. Augustine's opened the small quiet grave in which Anne Palmer had lain these 15 months. The oak coffin was raised upon 2 ropes into the raw light. It was carried in a cart to the vestry of the church. 2 fresh surgeons opened it. They took what remained of the young wife who had signed her name in a soft round script upon 3 thick cream papers, and they placed the small dark portions into a fresh stone jar, and they sealed it with tape and with red wax, and they carried it away to the laboratory of Dr. Taylor in London. And a week later the same was done at Stafford, where Walter Palmer had been laid down beside their father. His heavy coffin was raised. His remains were opened. Dr. Taylor received a second jar. In the small dark portions of Anne he found the traces of antimony. In the small dark portions of Walter he found the traces of antimony also. In the 4 small graves of the children in the yard of St. Augustine's no man dug that winter, and no man has dug since, and what lies there still. The trial was set for the spring, but no jury of the county of Stafford could be trusted. So wide had the story run, so bitter had the town of Rugeley grown against its own doctor. A special Act of Parliament was passed for the case, the first of its kind, so that the trial might be moved to the Central Criminal Court in London, at the Old Bailey. It was called by the newspapers of the day the trial of the century. It opened upon the 14th of May, in the year 1856. The court sat under the Lord Chief Justice of England, John Campbell, a stern grey Scotsman in a great white wig. The prosecution was led by the Attorney General himself, Alexander Cockburn, a small, quick man with a sharp, dark eye, and a voice that carried to the last row of the gallery. The defence was led by Sergeant William Shee, an Irish barrister of great warmth, who spoke for his client at the last, with tears standing upon his cheek. The prisoner was brought up each morning from the cells beneath the court. He wore a plain dark suit and a black silk stock. His pale bright eyes moved slowly along the rows of the jury. His soft attentive smile did not leave his face through 12 long days. The witnesses came and went. Mrs. Brooks spoke in her plain country voice of the scream that had come at midnight from the best bedroom of her inn. The boot boy spoke of the running for the doctor across the cobbles. Ismail Fisher spoke of the brandy upon the Thursday night at the Raven. Dr. Bamford spoke, shakily, of the plain draught he had mixed upon the small round table. The elder surgeon from Stafford spoke of the accident in the passage, and of the broken seal upon the tape, and of the small quantity of fluid that had been lost. Dr. Alfred Swain Taylor spoke for a full day, in his slow, patient voice, of the poison called strychnine, of its action upon the human frame, of the arching of the back and the locking of the jaw, of the staring eyes and the clenched hands, of the death that comes at last as a bow that has been strung too tight and abandoned. The jury listened. 12 plain men of the City of London. They did not once look at the prisoner in the dock. Sergeant Shee spoke for his client through 2 long days. He wept. He begged. He said no proof had been shown that his client had bought the poison, that no phial had been found in the doctor's house, that no witness had seen the powder measured into the spoon. He said the mother of the prisoner sat behind him in the court in her heavy black, and that she had raised her son in the fear of God, and that no such son could have done such a thing as this. He spoke his last words with his voice broken and his cheek wet. The court sat silent through them. The Attorney General rose in his turn. He spoke without tears. He laid out the small, quiet arithmetic of a country doctor. The debts of £12,000. The mother-in-law dead in a fortnight of her arriving. The wife dead within a month of the insurance being signed. The brother dead upon a Sunday afternoon with a bottle at his elbow. The friend dead in the best bedroom of an inn, opposite the doctor's own door, with his winnings gone from a small leather satchel. He asked the jury what small chance stood between all these deaths and the hand of a single man. He sat down. The Lord Chief Justice summed up upon the 12th day. He spoke for 5 hours in a slow, grave voice. He told the jury to weigh each small piece of the case in the pan of a scale, and to weigh it fairly, and to weigh it without pity and without hate. The jury retired at 2:30 of the afternoon. They came back into the court at 18 minutes past 4. The foreman rose. The clerk of the court asked the ancient question. The foreman answered in a plain, steady voice, "Guilty." The Lord Chief Justice put on the black cap. He passed the sentence in the old form of the law, that the prisoner should be taken hence to the place from which he had come, and thence to the place of execution, and there hanged by the neck until he was dead, and that his body should afterward be buried within the precincts of the gaol. Palmer stood in the dock through it all with the same soft, attentive smile upon his face. He bowed slightly to the bench. He turned. He was led down the small stone steps into the darkness beneath the court. He was carried back to Stafford by a special train, in a guarded carriage, upon the following night. The station of the town was crowded with silent faces. He was taken through the streets to the county gaol, in a closed cab with an armed escort. He was placed in the condemned cell. There he sat for another fortnight. He read a little of the Bible that had been laid upon the small table. He wrote a short letter to his mother. He did not confess. When the chaplain of the gaol pressed him upon the death of Cook, he answered only that Cook had not died of strychnine. He did not say what Cook had died of. He did not say who had given it. The morning of the 14th of June came at last, in the year 1856. It was a mild grey summer morning. A soft mist lay upon the fields outside the walls of Stafford. From the first light of the dawn the crowd had begun to gather in the open ground before the great grey gate of the gaol. They came from every town of the county and from many towns beyond. They came by the trains that had run all through the night, from Manchester and from Birmingham and from London. They came on foot from Rugeley, 12 miles down the road, with their bread and cheese wrapped in a cloth. By 8 of the clock some 30,000 souls stood pressed together in the open ground. Men, women, small children lifted upon shoulders. They did not push. They did not shout. They stood in a great silent field of faces, and the soft mist drifted above their heads, and the bells of St. Mary's tolled slowly across the roofs. The scaffold had been raised upon the flat top of the gatehouse. It was a plain wooden platform, painted black, with a heavy beam above and a single hemp rope hanging from it. A little after 7, the small side door of the gale opened. The chaplain came out first, reading in a low voice from the burial service. The executioner followed. He was a stout man called George Smith of Dudley. And then, walking without help between 2 warders, came William Palmer in a plain dark suit and a black silk stock. His pale bright eyes moved slowly along the roofs of the town. His soft attentive smile was still upon his face. He climbed the wooden steps of the scaffold with a steady tread. He stood upon the trap. The executioner drew a white hood down over the head. The rope was placed about the neck. And it is said, by those who stood closest below, that Palmer turned his hooded face a little toward the executioner at the last, and asked, in the same soft attentive voice, whether the drop was quite safe. Then the bolt was drawn, and the trap opened, and the small brief figure fell, and the rope snapped taut, and 30,000 faces did not make a sound. He hung for the ordinary hour. Then he was cut down. He was carried within the gale. He was laid in a plain deal coffin. Quicklime was poured about him. He was buried, without service and without stone, in the yard beside the wall, in a grave upon which no name was ever cut. His mother lived on in the brick house upon the market street of Rugeley for many years, in her heavy black and her small silver crucifix, and raised the one surviving grandson to be a quiet man who never spoke of his father in any room of any house. The small brick house upon the market street stands there still. The Talbot Arms stands there still. The 4 small graves in the yard of St. Augustine's have long since sunk into the grass, and the stones above them, if stones were ever set, cannot now be read. And so the story ends. Not with a cry, and not with a confession, and not with any word of sorrow. Only with a hooded figure upon a wooden platform in the mild grey light of a summer morning, and a great silent field of watching faces, and a soft slow mist drifting above the roofs of an English county town. Wherever you are listening tonight, in whatever quiet room you have carried this small light, let the room grow still around you. Let the breath grow slow. Let the small brown phial, upon a desk in a small back room, fade back into the shadow of the past where it belongs. The candle in the parlour of the brick house has burned low at last. The clock upon the mantel has ceased its slow ticking. The rain no longer taps at the window. And history, once again, turns the page in the dark.